Hello, everybody. My name is Mihai Pop, and I want to welcome everybody to the third day of the 27 IBA conference held this year due to COVID worldwide. So we are internationally this year. I'm from Romania, and together with Lori Roberts, we will be your moderators for the live session, Human-Bear Interaction and Management. This session is covering a topic that was born in the dawn of time of our existence. In our days, each research finished and each paper published helps our communities to better understand not just the bears, but also ourselves. Today, 10 exceptional researchers will help us to make one step further on this frontier of this topic of special interest. Before we start, we would like to appreciate the support of the sponsors of the IBA conference, especially Polar Bears International, who supported the organization of this session. Also to all organizers and all volunteers that were involved in helping us to connect and share our work. Very important to keep the conference going smoothly. We kindly ask you to use the question and answer icon for speaker questions. You already know how to do this. This was similar like in the previous 2 days. The chat is only for use among attendees and it will not be moderated. The questions will be after all the presentation at the end of the session. Also, you have to know that all questions and answers will be saved. We will start the session today with the invited speaker, Laura Conlee. Laura is the fur bearer biologist for the Missouri Department of Conservation. She worked for the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife for 8 years as the fur bearer and black bear project leader before coming to Missouri Department of Conservation in 2016. Laura currently oversees the black bear research program. She is co-chair of the large carnivore response team and monitors fur bearer and bear population to inform management decisions. Laura has worked with black bears since 2010 with the primary focus of conducting research to inform management decisions. Laura enjoys fishing, hunting, and gardening with her husband and 2 daughters. So, Laura, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mihai. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. If you can give me a thumbs up that you can hear me all right. All right. Okay. So I was asked to present a little bit on the history of black bear management. So the majority of work that I have done, well, all the work that I've done with bears has been with black bears. And part of this is because I had presented on some federally aid-funded bear research projects at a Wildlife Society conference a couple of years ago. And when they invited me to do this presentation, they asked, can you make it a little bit more broad, make sure you add Canada to the discussion here and provide some examples there. And so as I started talking with folks and digging in, this is one of those presentations that could easily take up a half a day. So I am going to paint this with a very broad brush and cover a lot. So a lot will be relatively general. There will be some specific examples and things like that. But I kind of, as I went through and researched more on the history of black bears across the country and across North America, it kind of highlighted just some interesting things for us as managers to think about, or as researchers informing management decisions to think about. So black bears were widely distributed throughout forested areas of North America prior to European settlement. They were used for fur, food, oil, a variety of different things by many indigenous cultures across the continent, and then by early European settlers as well. So as folks started coming to North America from other parts of the world, black bear were one of those species that were utilized for furred food in addition to those uses by many of the indigenous cultures here as well. But with that increased human settlement, we saw a lot of large-scale habitat changes in North America, and that followed colonization. We saw a lot of conversion of forest to agriculture and a lot of logging for building supplies. So here in Missouri, the southern part of our state here is very heavily forested. It was very heavily forested historically as well, but was almost cleared of its forest by the early 1900s. And so that large-scale habitat change really dictated the type of wildlife that we saw here in the state, and that is true for a variety of parts of the continent as well. Now, in agricultural areas, when you look at the literature, you look at historical documentation and things like that, bears were often viewed as a threat to people, to property. There was a lot of overexploitation. Bears were killed in response as protection of property, and that perceived threat. And in many parts of Bear Range, Black Bear Range, there were bounty systems put into place, and some of those bounty systems lasted into the mid-1900s. And so those bounty systems, coupled with that overexploitation for fur and food, as well as protection of property, combined with many of these large-scale habitat changes, really resulted in decline in bear numbers in a lot of different areas. And one of the things that we talk about when we talk about black bear management is that it's a huge conservation success story. So the fact that we still have this large carnivore persisting through much of its range just in and of itself is a huge conservation success story. But depending on the lens that you're looking at, it's a little bit different from what part of the country or what jurisdiction you're in. And so all of those factors resulted in declines in bear number and decline in bear range in many parts of the continent. Now, by the early to mid 1900s, bounties were eliminated in most places, and we saw many jurisdictions beginning to regulate take. So whether it was through season restrictions, whether it was through licensing requirements, things like that, classifying black bears as a game species or monitoring that classification, we started to see some changes. But in many areas, the damage was already done, and bear numbers were very, very low, if not non-existent, in a lot of parts of the continent. So we saw significant range reductions in many parts of North America. When we look to where I'm at, the southeastern United States, and in particular the central interior highlands, so here in Arkansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, we saw complete to near extirpation in bear numbers, and a lot of it was really that combination of habitat loss and overexploitation. When we look to populated areas of New England, so the eastern part of the United States, Massachusetts as an example, saw significant range contraction for black bear in the state, as well as substantial declines in the population. And even moving to the western United States, looking at Nevada, there was complete extirpation. So regardless of what part of the country you were in, there was kind of this variable nature of the impacts to bears. But we had population persistence in a lot of other areas as well, which is really important to keep in mind. So we did see some range reduction, but populations in many areas generally persisted. So when we look to a lot of the jurisdictions in the Western US, we saw population persistence. Most of the Canadian provinces, excluding Prince Edward Island, saw population persistence. Upper areas of the upper Midwest, so the Great Lakes region here in the United States and the northeastern United States, and even in parts of the southeastern United States, North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, we had population persistence. There were declines and range contractions, but we did have population persistence for black bears in those areas as well. Now, a lot changed in the United States with the passage of the Wildlife Restoration Act in 1937. So this act is commonly referred to the Pittman-Robertson Act, or PR. This is a program that grants funding to states and the District of Columbia and other insular areas that have legislation that provide hunting and fishing license revenue is used by the Fish and Wildlife Agency. And so funds are collected through excise taxes on revenues related to firearms, ammunition, archery equipment. And this act basically provides a funding source for hunter education and wildlife research. And early on, this program was utilized for some black bear research. So some of the earliest research projects that we have related to black bear were results of this funding source. So West Virginia and Arkansas were among the first to use PR dollars for black bears. In 1957, West Virginia conducted a research project to really get some baseline information on black bears within their jurisdiction, looking at normal life expectancy and habitat. In the first year, they captured just 3 bears, all of which were females. In Arkansas, in 1958, they began a reintroduction process into the Ozark and Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas. And so from the late 1950s until the 1960s, Arkansas Game and Fish released 254 black bears into the Ozarks and Ouachita Mountains of the state. And for many years, it was thought that there really wasn't a whole lot of success from that reintroduction program. They didn't see a lot of bears, but over time that population grew, and that right now is regarded as one of the most successful large carnivore reintroductions, because that population has grown substantially, has persisted, has allowed bears to expand into other parts of their former range, so in Oklahoma and here in Missouri. And part of the reason that we have this growing and recolonizing bear population in Missouri right now is a result of that Arkansas reintroduction process. And in the 1970s, North Carolina specifically looked at bear biology and habitat in eastern swamps and recognized that bear numbers had declined, range had contracted, and they really looked at the establishment and evaluation of bear sanctuaries, which has resulted in population expansions and natural recolonization within the state over the last essentially 50 years at this point. Now, another thing that kind of grew following the establishment of those PR funds in modern day wildlife management in the US was the idea that there was an opportunity to have discussions among jurisdictions, share ideas, discuss research needs, and kind of just bounce ideas off of one another. So there was the establishment of management forums, working groups, workshops, and the very first Eastern Black Bear Workshop was held in 1972 in New York. And this was one of those rabbit holes that you can go down. The proceedings for all of these workshops are hosted on the IBA website, and they are fascinating to read. You go through and there are state reports, there are topics of conversation that were pertinent in the early 70s, and much of the information and the discussions are still discussions that we as bear managers have today. And so in the introductory remarks, one of those things that just stood out, that this is one of those 50 years later almost, the statement still holds true. No matter how you look at the bear, he is an animal of many images. He reacts to people in different ways, and people react to him in different ways. As biologists, then, we have to consider the bear as an animal of great importance. And this really highlighted a shift in kind of the perception of black bear within many of these jurisdictions by the public, as well as by those fish and wildlife agencies. And we started to see the discussion at this time of that change in perception from the bear as a predator or a varmint to a game animal. And with that game animal status comes additional value and an increased need for research and an increased need for population monitoring and maintenance and conservation. Fast forward, well, sorry, not fast forward here, but at that same workshop, Pelton and Nichols presented a status of black bears in the Southeast. And if we compared that to the status of black bears today in the Southeast, this would look very, very different. So looking at the estimate of populations within all of these various jurisdictions, and many of these areas below 100 animals, very, very low numbers. And this survey discussed management challenges and research needs and things like that. But one of the things that really struck me was the categorization of bears to potential extirpation. So this is in the 70s. This is when they're looking at extirpation having occurred in a variety of different areas, significant range contractions in many areas, reductions in populations, and the fact that many of these jurisdictions were categorized into that unsatisfactory to hopeless due to the level of bear populations, the level of habitat changes and things like that that occurred in many of these jurisdictions. And among the many conclusions of this survey was that there's a long road ahead for bear conservation. But there was a bright spot that there were potential large blocks of land that still existed in the southeastern United States at this time that had potential to hold substantial bear populations with limited human habitation, and that this identified a lot of additional research, that really there was a scarcity of research related to bear ecology that could really help inform some of those management decisions. So all of this, you look back and it was a very different time. The status of bears was very different. And you kind of see the evolution of this topic of conversation. And so the third conference was hosted in 1976. And so just 3 conferences later, some of the discussions and the outlook had really changed. So from Joe Riefenberg, those of us who remember the first workshop in 1972 feel we've come a long way. Now, a lot of the data reported at Gatlinburg has been digested and techniques have become more sophisticated. An increasing number of field biologists are using radio telemetry. The widespread collection of teeth for aging is rapidly giving a picture of mortality. And by the time of our next workshop, our knowledge will have greatly expanded. And so it's so interesting to me that many of the things that we as managers right now just think of as the status quo or something that we've always done, this was the evolution of that. And so we really saw kind of this rapid evolution in bear research and bear conservation during this time period as it relates to black bears. And ironically, in these proceedings, there was a mention of the upcoming 4th International Conference on Bear Research and Management, which in 1977 was going to be in Kalispell. So I just thought that was a really fitting kind of transition. And then it wasn't restricted to the East. So the discussions about this and related to bear management, things like that, wasn't just restricted to the eastern part of the continent. Within the western part of the continent, they had the very first Western Bear Workshop in 1979. And within the proceedings of this, there are 19 state and provincial status reports. So there was tons of interest in this. And when you read the introduction to the proceedings to this conference, it was one of those things like, hey, we thought this was a good idea. We thought it would initially be restricted to the Southwest, but there was just so much interest so that they had this conference. And just like the Eastern Bear Workshop, Eastern Black Bear Workshop, the Western Black Bear Workshop is still something that continues today. And when you look at the topics that were of discussion, chemical restraint management techniques, population estimation, depredation and campground problems, all things we still talk about today. And so we really can look at these and see kind of the evolution in research, in management, and really, if I were to put myself in the shoes of a bear manager back at that time, it's one of those things that really makes me take pause. I take for granted the body of research that currently exists for bears and the techniques and things like that that are available to us. And it's because of these early workshops and these early forums and things like that that really helped that rapid evolution of bear management. And all of that focus on research and management and conservation really highlights the success story that black bear conservation is today. You know, we really look at this, and while you may look at this map compared to historical distribution and say, wow, I mean, bear range has been really reduced. Yeah, that's true. But compared to some other large carnivores, that reduction is much less. And when we look at this kind of breakdown in Canada, based on a paper by Scheich and McCown from 2014, we can see that black bears occupy about 95% of their historical range in Canada, which is incredible. In the United States, we saw substantial habitat loss and a substantial loss of historical range. But black bears are still very widely distributed. And so black bears occupy about 45% of their historical range within the United States. Many areas are seeing increasing populations, and many areas are seeing natural recolonization. In fact, I just did a cooperative discussion with one of our neighboring states, Kansas, because they're seeing an increase in bear sightings. They don't have a bear population at this point, but as a byproduct of the growing and expanding populations that we have in Arkansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma, Kansas is seeing some of that. So just kind of a different perspective. And when I started to look a little bit deeper and talk with some of my counterparts, the picture of bears is not the same everywhere. So again, this is painting it with a really broad brush, and I'm just going to highlight just some examples. So British Columbia, Canada, had abundant historical bear populations and abundant current populations. They've been regulated as a game species that has significant harvest opportunity, but one of the management challenges that jurisdiction faces is a significant agency response to human-bear conflict. And I think we're going to hear about that a little bit more today. And when we look to Nova Scotia, the other side of the continent in Canada, abundant historical and current populations, basically the same thing, that human-bear conflict accounts for a majority of the human-wildlife conflict reports that they get. And they've been doing some recent research on black bear management and the black bear population in that province. When we looked to the United States, North Carolina was one of those states in the Southeast that did not lose bears. Bears were never extirpated, but they were driven to those low population levels. But through sound management practices, they saw increasing populations, natural recolonization, and there's a significant body of research that exists for the state. And one of the current projects that they're working on, an urban-suburban bear study, is likely to be very relevant to black bear researchers all across the continent. And Nevada, a bear population that had been extirpated and due to a scarcity in reports was often excluded from most of the historical maps due to a lack of information. And so Carl Lackey in Nevada gave me an updated map to show that really highlights the historical range of black bears within that jurisdiction, and that they have an increasing bear population, and they are seeing range expansion. And in that state, there's a significant body of research as well. We talked a little bit about Arkansas. Arkansas and Missouri hit especially close to home. I'm based out of Missouri, work for the Department of Conservation here with a primary focus on black bears. And so in Arkansas, again, that reintroduction process resulted in this substantial bear population where they've been able to hold a hunting season since the 1980s, and Arkansas is still seeing continued population growth and expansion. Here in Missouri, we thought that bears had been extirpated by the early 1900s, but when we looked deeper and did a little bit of a genetic work, it's likely that we had a small remnant population that hung on in the most remote parts of the state. So the southern part of the state is a heavily forested area, very rural, and we're seeing that natural recolonization occurring from that growing Arkansas bear population, bolstering that small remnant population here, to the point where we have an established bear population within the state that is growing and expanding. And some of the issues that many jurisdictions have been dealing with for decades are now becoming the reality here as well in increasing numbers, where we're having bears showing up outside of some of our more suburban and urban areas, kind of up in the central part of the state. And we've been really looking at detailed research and monitoring really intensively since 2010. And all of that information has allowed us to understand bear habitat in the state of Missouri, understand population levels to the point where we're able to have our first hunting season here in about a month. So a really exciting time to be working here in the state, being able to see that evolution and kind of take that step back and look at the historical context as well, and just think what an incredible time to be working with bears. And the PR funds that we talked about initially that were so important, that early research, are still very important to bear research in the US as well. So from 2010 to 2019, there were nearly 100 grants issued to various states looking at a variety of different things. North Carolina utilizes this. This is one of the ways that they're utilizing that urban and suburban bear study. Nevada, the same thing, utilizing this for looking at genetic diversity and habitat selection, and really taking a step back and looking at the lessons learned over 20 years. And a lot of publications have resulted from the research out of Nevada. And then in Missouri, those PR dollars have been instrumental in helping us understand bear ecology so that we can inform sound management decisions here within the state. And the bear workshops, the Eastern Black Bear Workshop and the Western Black Bear Workshop still occur to this date, and they are super valuable resources for managers and things like that. The jurisdictional surveys that come out of these provide a really great picture at the regional levels as to what is going on for bear management, what are the priorities, how are these different jurisdictions monitoring their populations, and that was really, really important information for me to utilize when we were looking at the establishment of a hunting season. So these jurisdictional surveys were incredibly valuable for me. And just putting a plug out there, these bear workshops are coming up. So the Eastern Bear Workshop will be in Wisconsin in 2022, and the Western Bear Workshop will be in Wyoming in 2023. So these are really great resources, but that's not it. And obviously we're all here at the IBA conference. Another really, really great resource, but the International Human Bear Conflicts Workshop will be in Nevada in 2022. The IBA Managers Corner as part of the newsletter, super valuable resources for those that are interested in looking at that applied management and talking about that applied management. When I was emailing with Carl Lackey about this, he had said, hey, you know, what about the Managers Forum? And so for those of you that aren't aware, the IBA Managers Forum is really intended for bear managers to be able to have discussions about pertinent topics. And there's been a lot of really great threads that have come through this management forum talking about bear-resistant trash cans, and a really great opportunity for folks to ask questions of a large number of managers. So if you're interested, Carl Lackey or Dave Telesco can help you get signed up for that Managers Forum, but a really, really great resource. And then as we end this and kind of move into all of the next talks, one of the things that has been discussed over many, many years, there's been a variety of different publications about this, and something that is kind of a common discussion is consistency in messaging. And so the IBA Management Committee is looking at establishing a management definitions, some of that related to human bear conflict, and basically shifting the term to just encompass conflict bears, and removing any terms that place responsibility of human bear conflict on the bear. So kind of promoting that consistency in messaging. Another aspect to this is the establishment of Bearwise. So the southeastern states worked diligently over many, many years to develop this Bearwise program that's been adopted by a lot of different jurisdictions, with the main objective of providing consistent messaging and resources regardless of your jurisdictional boundaries. So if you were to drive from Missouri to Arkansas, cross the Mississippi River, go to Tennessee, hit Great Smoky Mountain National Park, you'd see the same messaging and the same talking points related to black bear vacation tips, black bear response, a lot of things related to black bear. So this has been a huge resource in the Southeast, and looking on expanding that outward. And then as we think about this, you know, I just challenge everybody for the Q&A part to ask some of those tough questions. What are some of the things that we're going to be facing in the future? So this has been in the literature a lot, shifting public attitudes. How's that going to play into black bear management or bear management in general? What about climate change? This is a topic that's come up here. I've received a lot of questions about that relative to black bears, but climate change and increased climate stressors, what can that do to bears, and how might that impact bear management? Increasing human populations or shifting human populations. You know, the human population here in Missouri is growing, and we have folks that are living in bear range that have never thought about living with bears, and we have bears showing up in areas where they haven't been in the last 50 to 100 years. So kind of thinking about that, how does habitat change play into that? And what about expanding bear populations? So some of the challenges that bear managers face now are managing abundant populations, where 50 years ago it was the opposite. We were talking about how to conserve those populations. So just some things to think about as we kind of move forward into the discussions. I'd really like to thank all of the folks that contributed to earlier versions of this presentation, provided information, and those that contributed to this current presentation. state bear biologists and things like that. I couldn't have put all of that information together without their help and without their input and their photographs and things like that. So I'd really like to give a shout out to all of those folks that helped out with that over the last couple of years, and just want to thank everybody, and really looking forward to all of the presentations today and the Q&A at the end. So thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for your presentation. It's always nice and interesting to see these long-term images of how management shifts. And regarding to your request about question and answer, I would like to ask the attendees to start putting question already on the question and answer page, because it will be a long session with 10 presentation, and I'm afraid that at the end you will not remember the question from the first presenter. So please ask questions as much as possible. Next speaker, it's Heather Johnson. Heather is a research wildlife biologist at the USGS Alaska Science Center, but we'll talk about work she conducted as a researcher for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Further, we will hear about the influence of use of residential development on annual black bear body fat, cub productivity, cub survival, and adult human survival, after accounting for variation in natural food availability and individual attributes. Heather, please share your work.
Great, thank you very much. Let's see. I'll start there. Okay, well, thanks so much for being here this morning and being here to listen. As Mihai said, I'm Heather Johnson. I'm from the Alaska Science Center, and I want to talk today about a paper that my co-authors and I recently published called Individual and Population Level Fitness Consequences of Black Bear Use of Residential Development. My co-authors on this work are Stuart Brack from the USDA National Wildlife Research Center and Dave Lewis from Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Okay, so as we are all well familiar, black bear use of human development is increasing in many parts of the country. As Laura was talking about in the previous talk, as bears are learning to forage on lots of different novel anthropogenic food resources. And, this shift is associated with big increases in interactions and conflicts between bears and people. There's been a lot of research on the behavioral responses of bears to using human development, finding, for example, that bears increase their use of development when natural foods are scarce. These figures came from one of our papers on this subject in 2015. So we've got all these papers and lots of research on bear behavior around development, but what we haven't known much about is how bears, using human development, how this influences their demographic rates and their population trends. People, when they see bears around town, they see big bears, healthy fat bears that often have lots of cubs. And that suggests, that all this extra human food that bears are using is really bolstering bear population. At the same time, there's also research to suggest that bear mortality is really high around human development, leaving folks to suggest that human development serves as a population sink or even an ecological trap for bears. So which is it? Does human development, does it serve to increase or reduce bear population? Understanding the answer to this question is really important as human development continues to expand across our landscapes, and as it appears that bears are increasing their use of human development, and all at the same time that management agencies are struggling to figure out how to reduce conflicts. So to address this question, we did a study, a 6-year study in Durango, Colorado. Durango, as you can see from the little inset there, is in the far southwest part of the state of Colorado. It's a town that's nestled in a valley that's surrounded by great bear habitat. And as you can see from the map there, it's a great place to study human-bear interactions and the influence of human development on bears, because there's lots of interactions between bears and people here. So to collect data on the demographic rates of bears that were living in and around town, we spent a lot of time trapping bears within about 10 kilometers of the city. We focused on trapping adult female bears because, you know, with that sex and age class marked, we could get information on adult female survival. The vital rate we know is most important for driving bear population growth rates. And then we could track those females to their dens each winter, get data on cub productivity, and then track those bears consecutive years and see cub survival. So by just coloring adult female bears, we got a lot of information about what was happening with bear demography in the system. Over the 6 years, we colored 83 different adult female bears, monitoring them for a total of 235 bear years. And then we collected data from 190 dens from them, getting that reproductive information. And the collars that we put out on those bears collected a location every hour. So we got really good information about how they're using the landscape. And so for each bear, each summer, we calculated their use of development. And we calculated that as the percent of time they spent within 100 meters of a human structure between June and September. And then we wanted to see how their use of development, how that influenced their body fat, their cub productivity, the survival of their cubs, and their survival in terms of adult survival. So we modeled each one of those fitness traits as a function of their use of human development, and then other covariates that we expected would also be important. So for example, for adult survival, in addition to looking at development, we also looked at annual variation in natural food conditions, a bear's age, and reproductive status. I've got the sample sizes we use there in parentheses. In terms of the statistics, to look at body fat, we used linear mixed models. For cub productivity, we used cumulative link models. For cub survival, logistic mixed regression models. And for adult survival, we used Cox hazard models. In the interest of time today, I'm just going to get to talk about our results relative to what we found with bear use of development. But we found a lot of really cool things with these other covariates, really novel things about black bears. For example, we found that body fat was really dependent on bear age. We found that cub survival really depended on the age of its mother. We documented reproductive senescence in black bears. So there's lots of cool things there to check out in the paper. But today I'm just going to talk about the results relative to bear use of human development. And the short answer in terms of its effects were that they were mixed in bears. So in terms of body fat, we found that, as you'd expect, as bears increased their use of human development and human foods, their body fat also increased. We found that a 10% increase in bear use of development during the summer was associated with about a 1.5% increase in body fat the following winter at their dens. We also found that increased use of development was associated with greater cub productivity. So in this plot here, this is showing the probability of a sow having different litter sizes. And so when a bear use of development is really low, what you see is that they're most likely to have twins. That's that blue purplish line. But as bear use of development increased, the probability of twins goes down as the probability of triplets goes up. And bears that spent at least 45% of their time around human development then were most likely to have triplets. But things switched when we look at survival. So here, as bear use of development increased, cub survival declined. We found that a 10% increase in use of development by a mother was associated with a 5% decline in annual cub survival. And a similar trend with adults, so that a 10% increase in their use of development was associated with a 3% decline in annual adult survival. So, we see that use of development has these mixed effects on different bear fitness traits. But what we really want to know then is what are the collective effects on bear population growth, bear population trends. So to get answers to that question, we developed a female-based population matrix model that used field data on that we collected on cub productivity, cub survival, and adult survival, and then it used literature estimates on yearling and 2-year-old survival. And I've got a life cycle diagram there that our matrix was based on. It's a little bit complicated because we incorporated all these effects that we found in our vital rate models into this population model. But when we incorporate all those effects, what we found was that collectively, what you see is that as bears increase their use of development, that the population growth rate was projected to decline. In our population, when bears were projected to use no development and natural food conditions were average, our bear population was predicted to have a growth rate right around 1. Lambda was 1, the population is stable. But as bears were projected to increase their use of development, or we had poor natural food conditions, we found that both those things additively reduced the bear population growth rate, causing a declining bear population. The population declines below 1 pretty quickly. Okay, so at the beginning, I presented this, this mixed paradigm that we see that lots of folks observe with bears around town. That, gosh, we see these big, healthy bears with lots of cubs. All this human food must be causing increases in the bear population. At the same time, we see lots of bear mortality. Our data demonstrated that both these things are true. Bears around town, they have more fat, they have more cubs. They also die at higher rates. And when you look at those effects, how they collectively influence the bear population, what you see is that increased mortality outweighs any benefit of increased reproduction and caused a net population decline. So in summary, we found that bear use of human development was associated with changes in all the fitness traits that we investigated. I think that's pretty important because a lot of times we don't have good demographic data on bears, but when we do collect it in a system like this, you see that use of human development is a dominant driver of bear population dynamics. Collectively, we found that the changes that we observed resulted in a declining bear population as their use of development increased. And really importantly, that effect was mediated by natural food conditions. So, whether towns served as a sink or how severe the sink was really depended, again, on those natural food conditions, whether natural food conditions were poor and, how poor they were. And this has big implications, especially for the Rocky Mountains, where we expect to have more natural food failures in the future with changing climate conditions. It's commonly assumed that increases in conflicts are driven by an increase in the bear population. But if development is operating as an ecological trap, that is to say that it's drawing bears into a place where they have reduced fitness, we could expect to see increases in conflicts despite a stable or even a declining bear population. And, finally, our work really underscores the importance of monitoring bear population trends to understand demographic responses to changing landscape conditions. And it also really emphasizes the need to consider demographic viability of bears when promoting coexistence. I think this work really raises that question of, is it coexistence if people and bears are on the same landscape, but if their bear population is declining? Is that coexistence? How do we want to define coexistence? Something I think would be fun to talk about in the Q&A. So with that, I really want to thank you for listening this morning. Please feel free to contact me with any questions. Our paper is freely available and downloadable on the web. I want to acknowledge Colorado Parks and Wildlife and the USDA National Wildlife Research Center for funding this work, and just give really a huge shout out to all the field technicians, all the people that helped me collect all this field data. Thank you so much. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's raising a lot of questions for a lot of parts of the world, like Colorado. So I hope we will have a lot of questions. Thank you again. Next speaker, it's Carmen Julia Qúiroga Pacheco. She's from Bolivia and she started working on the Andean Bear project in 2016. When Julia said to me that she knew it was going to be challenging, but not really to what extent. And 3 years later, when she saw her first bear, not from a camera trap picture, in that moment, she knew that everything was worth it, all the work that she done since then. So she's currently a PhD student at the University of Southwestern Norway. And she will introduce us in the landscape of Bolivia, where she studied the bear-cattle co-occurrence in one of the least studied ecosystem of inter-Andean dry forest. Julia, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll start sharing. Okay. Yeah, so today I'm going to move a little bit further south, and I'm going to talk about the Andean bear and cattle interaction. So I'm not going to talk about much about the Andean bear. Most of you are very specialists, so you already know that this is the only bear that we have in South America, and they have a mostly vegetarian diet. And they are also very charismatic species for like the general public, let's say, but that's not the same for the people living in the rural areas that share their space with bears, because as probably any other bear species or carnivore species, they are seen as livestock predators, right? But then again, we've been talking about this a lot, that human-wildlife conflict cannot really be generalized, right? It happens like very case study based. Let's say, like for example, in this paper I participated with Alex Zimmerman, we kind of look into jaguar human conflict all over South America, and we like couldn't find anything that could generalize like what is causing conflict, and it was really like case specific. So let's move a little bit to my study site. We use camera traps, and we sample sites that were a bit of a mix between protected lands like municipal and national protected areas, and also private lands. But as you can see, only the bear was reported before only in one of our study sites. So really, like all of these are new bear records for Bolivia, like for Andean bear in general, and for Bolivia. So that's very good. Like bears are there, so we need to update the range, the official range. As I mentioned before, we use camera trapping as the data collection, but then we use the data for occupancy modeling. So what this has to do with human-bear conflict? So before, most of the studies that I have seen or that are available around the web, focusing on Andean bear conflict specifically, are first very scarce, and then they're mostly focused on social data. Or when I talk about this with other people, we tend to use like cattle presence more as a covariate in a model rather than like accounting for the cattle movement and the cattle shift presence according to the season or the study sites. But when we were looking at the pictures for the project, we kind of realized that we were seeing more pictures of bears when the cattle was not present, and on the same site, cattle will start to come in our pictures like very often, but then we will not see bears over there. So we were thinking like we have reported conflict from the people, but then we are not seeing bear killings on cattle. We are not seeing bears eating cattle in our pictures, or like nothing. But then we are seeing this shift in the numbers. So we said maybe we can test this in an occupancy model. So the best approach obviously will be to use to kind of calculate the bear occupancy as a function of estimated occupancy of livestock. And then as a second option will be more like to estimate the relationship of occupancy of birds and livestock detection. It's not the best option, but then these two models are very data hungry, and despite having us like a lot of camera trap sites, we were kind of unsure that our data will have supported this modeling. So we kind of tested this, and thankfully, like we were able to run at least with basic models. In this case, this was like the second best option, like using cattle detection as a function of bear occupancy. And the best model for this one was the one that the bear occupancy was affected by cattle detections. But when we see a little bit of the season, like that's our poorest model, like because we did this multiple season models, and really like seasonality doesn't affect much the bears, but we are talking about the tropics, like you have dry and wet season, so maybe that's really season is not the best option, but cow detection does seem to have an effect on bear occupancy. So we then decided to test if we were going to be able to run the co-occurrence models, and with bear and cow occupancy, that was basically like the best option, because we are not looking at cattle present just as like a side covariate, like the cow is there, so maybe that will affect the presence or the absence of the bear. But it's more like how like the occupancy of these two across season is affecting, and it is like in interaction across season is being affected. So this means that cattle presence, cattle occupancy is affecting Andean bear occupancy. But when you see the estimates, it's occupancy in a negative way. So bears are kind of running away from cows because basically they share the same space, they share the same resources, like they're looking for water, they're looking for the same food, and they're looking for the same space. And also like this is free cattle ranching, right? Like people leave the cows alone for weeks, sometimes even months, and they come back to take them out of some places because they need some places to put to use it for some agricultural lands. There's not much human population density, it's more like cattle. So we can see that when we have our interaction models, our estimates for bear occupancy in our study site improve a little bit. Obviously, there is a shift of cow presence, probability of presence when a bear is present or either absent. Again, like demonstrating this interaction. But how this is useful for human-bear conflict in the case of these inter-Andean forests, dry forests of Bolivia specifically, is the bears are not chasing after the cows. We have not seen cows. Like this is the only picture that we have from a bear eating a cow in like a cow park, but we are not for sure that the bear killed the cow. But so that makes us think about like how to approach the problem, because we know that this is a perceived conflict. It's not like a real conflict, it's just a perceived conflict. So why are we going to put most of our resources in trying to handling much of the cattle, or building like a better management for cattle, because that's not really the problems. Like cow are still going to be like dying due to other reasons that the bear. So it's something very exciting about the project I'm working on. Like they realize that, we realize this, and we like cross this ecological data with the social data that we were getting and say like, okay, as the conflict is clearly perceived, now let's shift our focus into trying to like change people's attitudes. So now like they have the honey production in this side. So it's more that people are shifting their attention from cattle laws and seeing a bear to more like, oh, I'm producing honey, I can sell this, I'm earning money. And this is all happening because the Bear Project started to work here. So I think that that's the best approach for us. Again, like I want to emphasize in the fact that we have to see like this human bear conflict or human wildlife conflict more as a case study, because it's so hard to generalize. And maybe we can take ideas from other parts, and maybe there are some similarities, but we have to treat them as something specific. I'm not saying that there is no cattle Andean bear conflict in other parts of Bolivia or in other parts of South America. I'm just saying that it's not the reality in our study site, and that needs to be acknowledged. So obviously I want to give a special thanks to my supervisor, Andrea Cedroser, my boss and co-supervisor, Jimena, the field team and Jim Hines that help a little bit on the modeling, and all of our sponsors, because without the help of them, we couldn't have done any of the work. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Julia, for your presentation. Promising research in your area, I think. So good luck further with the research. Next speaker, it's Cody Miller. Cody is a master's student at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. And he is convinced that he has the cutest dog and most beautiful wife on planet Earth, which is, I think, great. So since looking back helps us moving forward, Cody will present an analysis of human-bear conflict based on data registered in the last 140 years of grizzly and black bears attacks. And Cody, hope that you put the pictures of your dog in your presentation. Good luck.
Okay. Unfortunately, I did not include any pictures of my dog. I didn't think to do that. Sorry. But there are lots of pictures of some pretty cute bears, so hopefully that will suffice. As Mihai just told you, my name is Cody Miller, and I am a graduate student at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. Today I'll be presenting a little bit of my master's thesis research, which is currently ongoing and is titled Human-Bear Conflict in North America, 1880 to 2020. So why a human-bear conflicts database? And from here on out in the text, that will be referred to as HBC to shorten things a bit. So a human-bear conflicts database will enable us to gain insights into the future avoidance of human-bear conflict, which is a win-win for everybody, both humans and bears. Human-bear conflict is detrimental to bear conservation efforts, in addition to obviously being often fatal for both humans and bears. It often results in the deaths of bears and people, and bad press often will turn the public's sentiment against management efforts, which can affect funding, as everybody has seen sensational headlines like these every time a human-bear conflict occurs, and such things only serve to turn the public sentiment against bears and bear conservation efforts in general. So we hope by compiling this database and conducting our analysis to be able to better inform the public as well as bear managers regarding how to avoid such conflict and avoid these detrimental effects on our conservation efforts. So our work entails the compilation of human-bear conflict incidents across North America. It includes data from both Canada and the United States going back to the 1880s, and includes more than 2,000 total incidents, 200 variables, and 500,000 individual data entries, and includes all 3 North American bear species: the black bear, the brown bear, and the polar bear. Dr. Stephen Herrero, who many of you have undoubtedly heard of, has made an integral contribution to our project. He is the author of the book, Bear Attacks, Their Causes and Avoidance. He is one of the foremost scientific authorities on human-bear conflict, and he is responsible for providing the majority of our data from Canada that we have applied to our database. And then Dr. Tom Smith, who you will be hearing from here in a little while, actually, is also one of the foremost scientific authorities on human-bear conflict and bear deterrent effectiveness. And he has provided the majority of the incident data from the United States in our database. All right, as stated previously, our data consists of more than 2,000 incidents, 200 variables, and 500,000 individual data entries. Our data comes primarily from official reports, newspaper clippings, and personal accounts. Our methods have consisted of and will continue to consist of 5 steps. The first step was to merge the Herrero and Smith databases and supplement those with other incident data that were not included in their data. Step 2 was a selection of a priori variables for initial data analysis. Obviously, it's not very practical to conduct data analysis on all 200 variables and 2,000 incidents, so we decided to focus on about a dozen variables that we thought would be the most prescient and important for today's management needs. And so we selected those. Step 3, which is the step that we are currently on, is data input and organization. So myself and several other researchers are currently in the process of poring over these sources, newspaper clippings and official reports and books, and we are filling out our database with all of the data and the variables that we can find. Once we're done with that, we'll be conducting data analysis and making inferences and publishing our findings. On the right here is a screenshot of our database in its current form. You can see some examples of some of the variables that we've included. And once we're done with step 3, we will have the database filled out and be able to conduct our analysis. So our results we expect to be able to glean many important patterns and insights for each of the variables that we are analyzing. Some examples of some of the variables that we're focusing on and that we hope to be able to learn new things about include dogs. Are they more of a deterrent or an attractant to bears? which strategies may work best for dealing with aggressive bears, which strategies are more statistically likely to have a good result for both humans and bears in an aggressive encounter. And how do specific bear and human actions and reactions affect the outcome of an encounter? We have more than 8,000 action-reaction pairings that we're looking at. And so basically what this consists of, the action-reaction pairings, is we're asking if-then questions, basically. So for example, if the person's first action at the beginning of an encounter is blank, what are the odds of the bear's reaction being blank? And given that reaction, what are the odds of blank occurring? Then we also have logistic regression analysis, and we'll be implementing logistic regression analysis and AIC model selection analysis, which will allow us to determine which variables are the most statistically likely to contribute to a given outcome, such as whether or not a mauling will occur. Another result of this study that we're very excited about is the future publication of this map that you see here. It's an interactive visual mapping tool. So this tool will allow researchers to toggle and manipulate different variables and produce a visual representation of them on the interactive map. So for example, a researcher could filter by year, by bear species, by region, by probable cause of incident, encounter type, etc., and display the relevant incidents on the map. We believe that this will be a very powerful management tool in the future, and we're very excited about that. And on the screen there, you can see an example on the right of the display map. And on the left, you see some of the tools that you can manipulate. And depending on which tools you select and manipulate, the output on the map will be different. Our research will yield many very important management implications. It will enable us to better inform managers and the general public regarding bear and human behavior in encounter situations. It will contribute to effective science-backed bear safety messaging. It will provide managers with powerful tools for protecting human life and improving bear conservation efforts. In particular, the future publication of the online interactive map and the results of our data analysis for our database. And I'd like to give a special thanks to the IBA Council and committee members, Dr. Herrero, Dr. Smith, Lena Chernello, Mackenzie Jepson, and the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies, which is helping to fund our project. And thank you very much. I hope you guys learned something, and thank you.
Thank you, Cody, for making a huge database and having a shorter talk will help your colleagues to speak more. So thank you for your presentation. And we go further to the next presenter, Andrea Corradini. It's that guy, that Italian guy that everybody loves. So I know Andrea, I worked with him in Romania for 2 years. Tried to convince him to work on bear. It didn't work. It was with links, targeting links, European links. So now he's almost done with his PhD related to bear, of course. Andrea, his family studied the impact of human disturbance on bear space using connectivity, and because he likes running and doing all kinds of sports in nature, he will explain us how he unified two paradigms, human mobility and animal movements, in order to quantify and predict how accumulated outdoor activity over the landscape affects the introduced brown bear population in central eastern Alps in Italy. Andrea, please.
Thank you. Yeah, in the end, I ended up on bears. I'm sorry for that. So, all right. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present my work. As Mihai said, I'm a PhD student, and today I'm going to present part of my research, and specifically the development of a new index to study the effect of human mobility on brown bears in the Italian Alps. So now we go back to Europe. As you all know, we live in an era where the effect of humans in the ecosystem, in the geology, is so profound that scientists came up with a specific term to identify it, Anthropocene. Specifically, the impact on the ecosystem are particularly important for animal species, and specifically they affect the distribution, the movement, the behavior, and the survival of animal species worldwide. Specifically through the modification of biotic condition, climate change, for instance, hunting, or introduction of invasive species. However, one of the facts that is most notable is actually the direct competition for space. There was an article published a couple of years, 3 years ago, on Science, where they showed that a higher human footprint correlates with a shortened movement of animals. And that's for a number of reasons, but that's meant there was actually direct competition for space. However, one of the problems is that this disturbance is often measured through proxies, and I'll show in a minute, and that cannot always fully portray the disturbance of humans. So let's take large carnivores as an example. They are some of the mammals with which they need the largest areas. We go from Alaska, where the home ranges are very large, but overall they require a lot of space, relatively undisturbed space. And in some places, such as Europe, these space needs need to be fulfilled in a highly densely populated environment. As you can see on the left, that's human population density, and per unit area, as you can see, except for the northern portions and islands, Europe is densely populated. In Europe, as all you know, there are 10 populations, and I'm going to focus on the alpine brown bear population. Brown bears, as you all know, they are fantastic model species. They're long-lived, so they're exposed to disturbance for a long time. They're non-territorial, so we can exclude territoriality and so all the constraints due to interspecific competition based on territories, and they're solitary animals. And specifically, the alpine brown bear population has been introduced together with the population in the Pyrenees, so just two populations that were introduced successfully. There's Austria, it was not successful, unfortunately, and the alpine area, it's one of the most densely populated mountain regions in the world. Just very briefly, the population declined in the last century. In 1997, the species was functionally extinct. That means only 3 animals remain in the wild, and action were needed to rescue this population and thanks to a live project that was carried out between 1999 and 2002. 10 bears were introduced from Slovenia, and today we estimate around 80 bears, with the population increasing. So when we talk about disturbance, we really need to distinguish the kind of disturbance we are talking about. There is a disturbance which is generally derived from infrastructure, land use, or human settlement. And this could be called as a structure or passive disturbance based on the presence of the infrastructure in themselves. Examples are the human footprints on the human influence index, which are based on different measure of human presence in the landscape. Or another notable layer is always used is the night light development, which use satellite images to see where lights are in the landscape, so human settlement mostly. And this is different to what we would call as an active disturbance, which is actually based on the effective use of such infrastructure, which is human mobility. Human mobility specifically is a branch of geography that studies the move of humans within a network or system. Is a pretty big field, and lately with the advance of GPS has been growing, but to this very day there is a small cross studies between human mobility and animal movement. And some of the human movement data are viewable. So Strava is a proprietary app. It's based in California, and they provide an app which you can use to record your outdoor activities, hiking, cycling, skiing. You record your activity, you upload it on your phone, and when you send this data to Strava, they build with anonymous, and they anonymize the data, and they build a heat map, which a higher intensity means that there is a higher use of a given pixel. And this maps is viewable on the internet, and you can access Googling Strava heat map. So we had this data, which is accessible for all the world. So through digital image processing, which means working at like what you do with pictures, working with the bands of an image. So we're talking about the RGB bands, the red, the green, and the blue. So working with the colors, we extracted the intensity of value based on the heat map. So pretty much like when you will do with NVIs, you will give a value based on, in our case, about intensity, and you will correlate with a higher use by a human. And this produces like a raster map. But someone could argue, well, maybe that's not representative of the actual presence of humans in the landscape. So using camera trapping data from an independent studies that was carried out in the same study area, we correlated the two, and we found like a positive, a significant correlation between the number of people detected per each camera and the value of the raster. So we developed what we call the Cumulated Outdoor Activity Index, which is the raster layer, and which is an effective human presence, indicator of human presence in the landscape. So next, we wanted to test how this perform with comparing with the brown bear space use. So our first hypothesis was to see if the bear habitat selection within their home ranges was constrained more by the active competition for space, so human mobility, than the classic infrastructure-based competition proxies. We use GPS data, brown bears. We use what's called the third order selection, resource selection function, using GLMM. And what we did, we we had different models with different type of distribution. We couldn't put that together because of the correlation, but we ran them in parallel. And so here you have a glance of the GPS data. This is the Central Alps, as we said before. We could use data from 18 animals, captures between 2006 and 2019. So what we found is that the COI was overall a better predictor for bear space use than the other proxies. The other proxies were distance from paved road, forest road, trails, density of roads, distance from human settlement, and distance from all roads. And interesting, we also see that the predicted probability of use dropped fairly quickly with the increase of disturbance after the index, showing that at the low value disturbance, the use was really dropped pretty quickly. Then we want to go further and test. We had a further hypothesis. Well, when they select home ranges in the landscape, do they have to compromise or trade off this, the space use and the access to resources with the risk perception? And we did so using the same GPS data. We use again the disturbance index. We use resources, and specifically we could derive with Clara Tattoni, which is also a member of the IBA. We derived the fruit availability map in the landscape as a species richness map of all species that were known to be consumed by brown bears. And we developed a raster map for every month. And we control for habitat variability, specifically use NVI, and we consider at the months, so to see if they were different throughout the stages of a brown bear life. And what we see in this case, that the NVI, in this case heavy, was the best predictor in the model, which is makes sense. And then disturbance was the second most important, and there was all year round. And also they selected for steep area, which it's common in the alpine landscape, likely because they can serve as refuges against disturbance. What we also found very interesting is that animals they use some sort of trade-off or compromise, meaning that during the later months, animals decrease the access to resources when disturbance was high. So this was pretty interesting. So which are our conclusion on this quick journey of human disturbance on alpine brown bears? We think, and there's data supporting this statement, that considering the effective presence of humans in the landscape using infrastructure is a more effective way to study the presence and potential disturbance of humans, because the other proxies not always can portray as well, specifically where there is a high level of human use of tourism, such as the Alps. Bears, as you all know, have a great cognitive map, which is not just mental, it's based on sensory perceptions. And it seems that because it's a cumulated outdoor activity, it seems they have a great perception of this risk spatio-temporally, and they minimize the risk exposure at different scales. And so lastly, as we were saying, it seems also that they need to compromise specifically also with regards of resource access. And this brings two important points. One is the role of human as what's called super predators. So they have an effect. So they some sort of they have an effect on foraging ecology as well. So we can speculate that this effect could be at the fjord level, what we would call a fjord ecology. But most importantly, in places such as Europe, the inclusion of humans is particularly important because to coexist with brown bears, we need to really work at the community ecology level, which means that the humans are not this layer of disturbance, but rather part of the community. So using their movement into the space would help a lot understand what would be ultimately the space use of brown bears and any other wildlife that live and coexist with humans. Yes, I would just want to thank my supervisor that helped me with the work, the students, and all the collaborators. And I didn't enter too much into the details, but if you have any question, I'll be happy to answer them later. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for your presentation. And don't be sorry that you are working with bears now. A lot of people from the IBA are very happy that you join us. So keep on walking or going or running, whatever you like. Thank you, everybody, for staying on time with your presentations. The questions are running. I am going to start also voting the questions. We have a lot of questions, and in the end, we would like to have the questions that are more relevant for everybody, for the attendees. I was hoping that I would have the right for one question, but I think I will leave somebody else to questions. So we will have a 30 minutes coffee break, and we will start the discussion at 10:30 Montana time. Now it's not sure exactly. So see you in 30 minutes. Thank you for joining us, and we are waiting you also on the second part of the session. Next speaker is Andrea Morehouse. Andrea earned a degree in biology from Tufts University and worked on various wildlife projects across North America before moving to Alberta pursue graduate degrees at the University of Alberta. Andrea owns and operates Denisse Research and Consulting, a private research and consulting group that helps governments and private entities address issues and answer questions related to large carnivore in multi-use landscapes. She will speak about how to use temporal trends in large carnivore conflicts and community surveys in order to address human carnivore conflicts. Andrea, please.
Thank you. I'll just get sharing here. Okay, there we go. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. I'm happy to be participating today. And what I'm going to talk about is some work from Southwestern Alberta, where we have been working to mitigate conflicts between people and large carnivores. So I'll talk a little bit about the work that we do and share some results from some recent evaluation work that we've completed. And before I begin, I just want to emphasize that this work is very much community-based and landowner-driven, and has been very much a collaboration with a number of individuals within the community. I also want to acknowledge my co-authors, Courtney Hughes is a social scientist with Alberta Environment and Parks. Nora Manners is the executive director of the Waterton Biosphere Reserve, as well as a local landowner. And Jeff Bechtel and Tony Bruder are both cattle ranchers in Southwestern Alberta, and are also participants in the Carnivores and Communities program. So just a quick map here to give you a little bit of context where we are. As I've mentioned, we're in the very southwestern corner of Alberta, so just north of Montana and just west of British Columbia. And generally the area that we work in is that blue shaded area on the map. And just a little bit more sort of context and background to that area. Southwestern Alberta is where the mountains meet the prairies. And what that means is that there is a rather abrupt interface between forested mountainous public lands to the west and private agricultural lands to the east. It's a multi-use landscape. There's oil and gas, recreation, forestry, but the predominant land use on private lands is agriculture, and that includes both livestock and crop production. And on top of this, we've got 4 native large carnivore species: grizzly bears, black bears, wolves, and cougars. And there's a high degree of overlap between the home ranges of these carnivores and private agricultural lands. There's simply put, there's not enough space on the public land to support the populations of these large carnivores that we have present. And so consequently, there's of course the potential for conflict. And a few examples of the type of conflict that we have in this area. Carnivores kill livestock and pets. They can cause property damage, including damage to standing crops and stored grain, silage. There's also very much a public safety concern, particularly as it relates to grizzly bears. This photo on the top right, for example, was taken by a landowner from his kitchen window. And understandably, that sort of scenario makes people a little bit nervous. So to help address some of these concerns, a local nonprofit in the area, the Waterton Biosphere Reserve, together in partnership with government agencies, non-government agencies, and landowners, formed the Carnivores and Communities program in 2009. And through this program, we work with farmers, ranchers, and other rural residents to try and reduce conflicts between people and large carnivores in southwestern Alberta. There's a number of different components to the program, but today I'm going to highlight the three main on-the-ground activities. And those include attractant management projects. These are projects such as electric fencing, changes to grain bins, so putting in a cement floor, putting in a bear-resistant door, switching it out for a hopper bottom bin. These are a couple of examples. Dead stock refers to removing livestock carcasses from the landscape. These are a big attractant in the area for all large carnivores. And we've seen an increase in the prevalence of these in recent years due to changes around the way in which livestock carcasses can be transported and disposed of. And so that's become an increasing problem. And then bear safety workshops. And these are workshops designed specifically for farm and ranch families to address their specific safety questions and to share information about carnivore behavior, as well as teach folks the proper use of bear spray. And so, as I mentioned, this program started in 2009. Since that time, we've completed over 100 of these cost-shared attractant management projects. These are generally cost shared on a roughly a 50-50 basis between the Waterton Biosphere Reserve's Carnivores and Communities program and the landowner. We've removed just about 5,500 livestock carcasses and have hosted 8 bear safety workshops. So the question became, okay, well, we've been doing this for a while, does it work? Or how effective is this program in achieving its goal? And so that's what I want to transition to talk about next, is some program evaluation work that we've done. To evaluate the program, we used 2 main components, a social survey, as well as a review of provincial occurrence records. These are essentially complaint data. And today I want to just highlight or share some of the highlights of these results. I'd be happy to talk further with anyone about the additional information. So the social survey, this was done online, and we advertised it through a variety of outlets. It was open for 7 weeks, and we did also have a paper survey that was available on request. We asked questions related to demographics and individuals' general awareness and motivation to participate in the Carnivores and Communities program. We asked them about their sense of their safety risks associated with large carnivores. We asked about their perceptions of the attractant management program, the dead stock removal program, and bear safety workshops. In total, we had 116 responses. And in these next couple of slides, I'll highlight some of the results as they relate to those 3 primary on-the-ground components of the program. So I'll begin with the attractant management program. 45.1% of participants in that program felt that it helped reduce conflicts, and 41.2% said it was cost effective. I want to mention here that it's not that the rest of people thought that it was not effective. It's that a lot of folks were still undecided. So in both cases, we had 49% of the people that responded that had participated in the program said that they weren't quite sure. They were undecided as to the effectiveness of that. We also asked all survey respondents their perception of the program, regardless of whether or not they themselves had directly participated. And in that case, 67.9% said the program was effective. We received very positive responses about the dead stock removal program. 75.5% believe the program helped reduce conflicts with carnivores, and 84.6% said that they wanted that program to continue. We also asked a number of questions where individuals could provide a written comment, and several of those comments were also quite positive. For example, this particular rancher said that dead stock removal is an integral part of attractant management and is directly beneficial to a large number of people. There was also very positive views of the bear safety workshops. So 60.6% said that the program was readily available to folks within the community. Just over half agreed that it helped reduce conflicts. And again, right around half felt that they had an increased sense of safety after completing the workshop. And from my perspective, perhaps one of the more exciting results that came out of this is that 61.6% of program participants said that they now carry bear spray as a direct result of participating in that workshop. So that's a really, I think, positive outcome. And then I want to transition now to talk about some of the review of the provincial occurrence records, some of those results. And again, these are the provincial complaint data that are reported to the provincial government. And we reviewed records from 1999 through 2016. And we looked at records that fell only within our focal area, so that blue area on the map that I showed you previously. And there was 1,696 records for that area for that time period. And we looked at what we called an incident, and those are situations where a carnivore obtained anthropogenic food, killed or attempted to kill livestock or pets, or caused property damage. So basically any situation where there was some sort of actual interaction between a human land use activity and a carnivore. And we focused specifically on grizzly bear incidents because most of the projects most of the attractant management projects were designed primarily to address grizzly bear agricultural conflicts. And we then looked at the trend in these incident records before versus after the implementation of the Carnivores and Communities program. And so again, I've pulled some of the highlights for my talk today here. So this is a graph of grizzly bear incidents. And what we see on here, so the x-axis is the year and the y-axis is the number of reported incidents. The black squares are total grizzly bear incidents, and the blue circles are grizzly bear incidents that are related to some sort of attractant before the beginning of the Carnivores and Communities program. And then red is grizzly bear attractant incidents after the Carnivores and Communities program was implemented. And so you can see that there's this shift in sort of an increasing trend before versus a decreasing after. And 2015 and 16 in particular were quite low years. We are trying to extend these graphs. We're running into some challenges in accessing some additional data on this, but we're working on that and hoping that we're going to see that pattern continue. And a similar pattern when we look at the dead stock incidents. So this graph is set up the same way. X-axis is the year, Y is the number of reported incidents. And these are not just for grizzly bears, but this is all large carnivores. And again, an increasing trend before versus a decreasing trend after the implementation of the program. I want to share one note about these occurrence records. This was because this is, I think, important. We know that complaint data are not perfect. And one thing I think is important to note is that these records only represent the events that are reported. We don't have a way of tracking the unreported events. And so to this end, we asked survey participants how likely they were to report on a variety of different types of occurrences. And I just want to highlight a couple of the things here. So just over 70% said that they would report livestock incidents at least half the time. But for other types of occurrences, the reporting rate was far less. And I think that's important to keep in mind. So in this context, I think what we're seeing is that the occurrence records likely underrepresent the extent of carnivore activity in the area. So we haven't solved all the problems. There's definitely still lots of work to do. Livestock depredation in particular is an ongoing challenge, as is trying to maintain that dead stock program. It's I think quite effective, but funding is a continual challenge for that. But you know, the results here, I think, show that the Carnivores and Communities program is really having a positive impact, and we now have some data behind that to support the continuation of that program, and some information on the evaluation of the effectiveness. And I think it also serves as a good example, a successful example of a community-based, landowner-driven program that is really helping people and carnivores better share the landscape. Certainly this work wouldn't be possible without financial and kind support from a variety of organizations, so I want to make sure I acknowledge them. And I'll reiterate here that I've just scratched the surface of all the information from this area and the work that we're doing, so please don't hesitate to reach out. I'd be happy to chat further about any of the information and the work that we're doing. Some of the information I presented today is published in a paper in Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution, and we also have another paper that we're just about getting ready to submit on more specifically the dead stock program. So thank you very much, and yeah, enjoy the rest of the talks in this conference, and hopefully I will chat with some of you over the next couple of days. So I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Andrea, for your presentation and showing us that conflict mitigation, it's a process and has ups and downs. Good to be on a down path to reduce, to improve coexistence. Thank you again. The next speaker is Denisse Mateo Chero. She serves at San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance in a consultant capacity as a field program coordinator in population sustainability. She's a Peruvian biologist engaged in developing, coordinating, and implementing ecological research on wild bears in Peru, and also conducting outreach efforts. Denisse will present an interesting study on how Andean bears from southeast of Peru in Manu National Park are sharing the space with local communities, specifically how Andean bears are showing the temporal response to passage of humans. Denisse, you have the floor.
Hi, thanks for the introduction. Okay, I'm going to share. Okay. Okay. Good morning with everybody. Well, the research I'm going to present is about the temporal interactions among Andean bears, large mammals, and humans in southeast Peru. Over the time, the interest about ecotourism in natural areas has increased as an alternative to promote conservation by the government and private entities, offering a wide of economic benefits for locals, developing diverse of human activities in the area. Natural areas with huge diverse of landscape, wildlife, and low human presence, such as Manu National Park, become potential targets, ignoring the possible effects on wildlife, even by the low scale of human presence. That's why this analysis is important to understand more about the wildlife response to humans in these protected natural areas. There are other studies that are using different methods to analyze temporal occupancy of wildlife to respond humans, based on camera trapping to focus on the latency of days or the time interval to detect species B after species A versus species A after species B, where this last type of interactions works as our data control, referring to human after bears. This is the map of our study area. This analysis is part of a data set collected from a bigger study called La ecología y el comportamiento del oso andino en el sureste de Perú, developed in Manu National Park, which is recognized by UNESCO as World Heritage Site. It's located in the southern part of Peru, in the department of Cusco, in the Cosñipata Valley. The diamonds represent areas where we are studying, areas without human presence, neither any conflicts between humans and wildlife or hunting. Our camera stations are located along the valley in an altitude from almost 4,000 meters above sea level of grasslands and cloud forest ecosystem, including private areas in the buffer zone, inside the yellow circle, as some biological stations as by Waiquecha, Bosque Nublado, Mano endemic stations, and being in the lowest part at 530 meters above sea level. For something to add is that we are not using any lures in neither of our camera stations. Okay, for our method, the data was collected from 60 camera stations. They were visited 4 times per year from 2017 until 2019. We defined independent detections for at least 1 hour apart from each other, from each individual, excluding all latencies above 14 days. And we use data from mammal species that present at least 5 latency types. In our results, we detect about 45 species of terrestrial wild mammals, which only 6 species present sufficient data for this analysis. Andean bears were only detected from 1,500 to almost 4,000 meters above sea level in our study area. Those pictures in the screen are part of our data set, and they are from researchers only. In the next slides, I'm going to share a scheme of data from the other 6 analyses we are using. There is the Masama Chunji. In the bottom right of this slide, we can see independent detections, most of that were nocturnal. Actually, is very little known about this deer in the area, and probably in other areas could be a target for hunting. In the left, there are 2 columns of dots for each type of detections. The first type is Masama Chunji after human, and the second is human after Masama Chunji. Their average determined for the blue bars shows there is not too much difference in both latencies. It's less than a day to use the trail after human presence. So the statistic analysis shows the probability for this deer to be affected by human is low. For Masama americana, the differences between average of both type of encounters is less than a day. And also the probability indicates there is a low human impact on the deer. For tapir has a total nocturnal pattern. This species was detected only in a low part of the study area. So the difference between average of both type of encounters show there is not too much difference. And the statistic value indicates there is not an effect on the tapir. For jaguar, both human and jaguar are active during the day, and the average are very similar for each column. Also, there is not a statistic evidence for this interaction. For puma, this fortuna show that is diurnal patterns, and its behavior response to humans are very low, and also the statistics analysis show there is not effect, even knowing that this species used to be a target in conflict areas, but this is not happening in our area. For Andean bear, the activity patterns are diurnal, similar to human, and this is interesting because some interaction studies focus only on the overlapping activity patterns. but in this analysis, we are we realize the average of the type of the encounters are very different. While in the right column, the average are 8 days, in the other are 3 days. So the statistic value show us is a remarkable reaction on the Andean bear behavior because there is almost 5 days of latency for bears to use trail after human. I'm sorry. Is a possibility they are avoiding human presence in this study area. And this is very interesting because in the other side of the protected natural area, in the other side of the buffer zone, there are local communities in the Mapacho Valley, where there are records of negative interactions with humans because the loss of their crops or cattle attack by Andean bears. So the Andean bears reaction was very unexpected. This is very surprising because the results we get from this analysis show us this is very sensitive. Even when we know the bear used to visit fields with a high level of human activity. Also, we realize that even with a low human presence, there is a possibility to do a negative impact to change the wild behavior and their activity patterns. Because of this, it's important to continue the analysis and probably comparing to the behavior of their response in areas with human activity. Okay, thank you for this opportunity. Thank you too for all the supportings.
Thank you. Thank you, Denisse. Thank you, Denisse, for your presentation.
Okay.
The next speaker is Robert Marquez. He has over 20 years of experience working on Andean bear natural history, management and conservation, and he is the Andean Bear Conservation Alliance coordinator and PhD candidate at Cornell University. Robert is interested in facilitating management decision making by generating information on Andean bear status and threats, as well as generating tools to monitor Andean bear population and manage interaction between Andean bears and people. Robert asked us to be patient with him a little bit to start his pre-recorded presentation. So, Robert, please.
Hi, Mihai, and thanks for your introduction. Let me try to present this video. Give me a second, please, to try.
We are here to help.
Yeah, can you see the video?
We see the image. Please start to see if we have also the sound.
Hello, everyone. I'm Robert, and today I will be presenting research involving human and Andean bear interaction, which is part of my PhD dissertation at Cornell University. I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Rich, Dave, Isaac, and Angela. Andean bears are considered vulnerable due to the loss and fragmentation of their habitat. In addition, negative interaction between humans and wildlife can result in retaliation hunting, which could be a significant threat to Andean bear population. Nevertheless, since hunting is illegal across the distribution of this species, Andean bear hunting activities go unreported. Andean bear attacks occur mainly on free-range livestock and core crops, and to a lesser extent on pigs, banana and plantain crops, horses, donkeys, and sheep. Andean bears typically attack only one animal or a few plants. There are no reports of Andean bear attacks on humans. Losses do not affect regional commercial production. Still, they are usually significant to the owner because communities that occur in landscape with Andean bears have limited economic resources. Therefore, any loss or damage could represent a significant economic hardship. There is a lack of guidance regarding negative human and Andean bear interactions to help with decision making and develop best management practices. Therefore, our objectives are to evaluate the type and magnitude of potential factors affecting, first, the livestock losses caused by Andean bears. Second, people's attitude toward Andean bears, including whether people who have experienced livestock losses or perceive their property to be threatened by Andean bears are more likely to have a negative attitude toward Andean bears. And third, Andean bear hunting while accounting for imperfect detection and reporting of hunting. Between 2016 and 2018, we conducted 1,516 surveys in forest study areas, 128 villages, mainly in Colombia, but also in Peru. The locations are shown with black dot on this map. We surveyed one person per farm, mostly the head of the family or the person responsible for the farm. Questions were designed to obtain information about family, husbandry practices, livestock losses, an opinion about Andean bears, other people, and institutions. We used logistic regression to evaluate factors affecting livestock losses caused by Andean bears and people's attitude towards Andean bears. First, we used the report of livestock losses to explore the contribution of 10 factors related to environmental variables and husbandry practices in predicting livestock losses caused by Andean bears. Also, we used the opinion about Andean bear present near the farm as a binary covariant to explore the contribution of 9 variables on people's attitudes toward Andean bears. Since hunting of Andean bear is illegal and determining Andean bear hunting is complex, we assume that when in the village there were one or more reports of hunting, it is because there really was hunting of the Andean bear. But we assume the absence of hunting report could mean that, first, people really know that not hunting have occurred in the village, or people know that hunting have occurred, but they do not report this knowledge because they know it is illegal to hunt Andean bears. Based on that, we fit single season site occupancy models accounting for imperfect detection of Andean bear hunting by using the response to the statement. At least one neighbor have killed an Andean bear in this village in the last 5 years. We explored the influence on Andean bear hunting of 7 factors and the influence on the detectability of 4 factors to estimate the probability of Andean bear hunting in each village using 918 surveys, non-uniformly distributed among 128 sites or villages. The results were the following. Livestock losses were associated with the cover type, where the farm was located, higher in paramo areas. The type of fence surrounding livestock, lower when using electric fences or poles to tie livestock. The management of carcasses, lower when the attractant was removed. The study area, evidencing the importance of the characteristic of the Andean bear population and landscapes. The distance between the farmhouse and livestock, lower closer to an inhabited farmhouse. The frequency of visit to livestock, lower with more than 2 visits per week. The inhabited farmhouse, lower when people live in the farmhouse. And the number of livestock on a farm, higher for farms with more animals. 14 models were included in the MES model selection, but none included slope or quantity of habitat. People attitude towards Andean bears were mainly affected by locality, showing the importance of the local context and the proximity of communities in the territory. The perception about livestock injury or livestock or crop loss, more negative when people fear or believe they will suffer livestock or crop losses. The social norm. So, the attitude of the respondent was affected in the same direction as the attitude perceived from family, neighbors, and friends. The income from livestock having a negative effect, so the higher the relative value of aged livestock, the more negative the attitude developed. The gender, with the attitude of women being more negative, perhaps because of family care and the higher contact of male with Andean bears. The formal norms having a negative effect, so if people know more about the law that protect the bears, more negative attitudes are developed. And finally, the inhabited farmhouse, more positive when people do not live in the farmhouse. Other factors, including trust in government organization and livestock losses, have a low importance. The probability of Andean bear hunting was associated with the level of trust in government organization. So, the highest the trust, the lower the probability of hunting. The amount of income derived from livestock, so higher relative value implies higher probability of hunting. The formal norm, so the knowledge about the protection of bears and sanction for persecution reduce the probability of hunting. Livestock losses, so although livestock losses do not have a significant effect on people's attitude, they have a more considerable effect on Andean bear hunting. The attitude toward bears, so more positive attitude imply lower probability of hunting. The social norm and the perception about livestock injury or livestock or crop loss. Finally, the detection of the Andean bear hunting was associated with formal norm. If people know more about the protection of the bear and the sanction for the persecution of this species, the detectability is lower. So, it seems local people hide the Andean bear hunting. The good news, Andean bears are like other bears, like other animals. So, livestock injury and livestock or crop losses can be reduced by improving husbandry practices and farm management. But if it is so easy to reduce the damage, why do people not improve their management? And why do negative interactions still exist? First, people's trust in institutions, in government organization is low. People's attitude toward government organization are negative, and people's opinion about the effectiveness of activities to reduce losses, including the change in productive activities, are negative for several farmers. But also, people do not have funds, Consequently, people do not want to follow this management recommendation. In addition, government organizations are not able to enforce the formal norms. Based on our result, the first and more important step is increasing the trust in government organizations, which must be increased via highest presence and greater effectiveness of their actions. Once we begin to increase the trust in government organizations, it is also necessary to educate farmers regarding activities to improve husbandry practices and the laws and regulations that prohibit the hunting and persecution of Andean bear. But also it is necessary to support or facilitate the improvement of cattle husbandry practices and farm management to reduce the probability and fear of livestock injury or livestock or crop loss. We need to help them to develop this management. It is very important to carry out any action via community-based programs, including local and regional organizations, because people's attitudes are affected by the attitude of others in the community. That is the social norms. In addition, the increase of trust in government organizations will facilitate the enforcement of the formal norms to reduce the hunting of Andean bear. Finally, an essential factor not assessed in this research is the promoting of the economic and social value of the Andean bear present, which we have observed has resulted in significant changes in people's attitude towards bears. We want to thank all organizations and people who participated and helped facilitate the development of this research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert, for your
Thank you.
presentation. I'm happy that I have also the video, so I can see it several times. Maybe if you allow me, I will show it to some of my colleagues if you agree with it. So,
for sure.
Thank you, Robert. The next presenter is Jessica Braunstein. She's currently a PhD student at the University of Tennessee, and her research interests include mammal ecology and conservation. One of her colleagues described her as a driven, hardworking, and well-organized boss, student, cohort, and friend. Jessica will talk about how food conditioning of American black bears is related to conflict behavior that often occurs in communities nearby Great Smoky Mountains National Park.
Thank you. Get the screen going. Hi everyone. Thanks for staying tuned in to this session. Like Mihai said, I'm going to be talking about a study that was conducted from 2015 to 2018 in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And we were specifically looking at black bear movement and food conditioning along the Urban-Wildland interface. And I think it's important to mention my co-authors on this, Dr. Joe Clark at USGS and the University of Tennessee, and Ryan Williamson and Bill Stiver with the National Park Service. So just a little bit of background about Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which I'll be referring to as the park for the rest of the talk. It straddles the Tennessee-North Carolina border, and it's also the most visited national park in the United States. The park receives over 11 million visitors each year. And it's also home to an estimated 1,900 American black bears. So as you can imagine, when you have that many bears and that many tourists, you're going to have a lot of human-bear interaction. Now, park personnel currently use proactive management approaches to try and prevent conflict behavior from becoming established in bears in the park. So they do this by emphasizing trash management, and they also use aversive conditioning practices. However, despite these ongoing efforts, in the years prior to the start of our study in 2015, park officials noticed bears were exhibiting advanced conflict behavior patterns within the park, which raised the question, well, where are these bears learning these behaviors? So the park is surrounded by quite a few cities and communities. So on that map, you can see the park boundary in black, and each of those red stars is one of the communities surrounding the park. And so there's some speculation that these bears actually leave park boundaries, go into these communities, develop conflict behaviors there, and then bring those back into the park. I think it's also worth noting that the city of Gatlinburg, which is on the Tennessee side of the park, kind of on that northern boundary there, is currently the only community around the park with any sort of legal mandate requiring residents and businesses to use bear-resistant trash containers of some sort. Specifically, our study objectives included using stable isotopes from hair samples to distinguish between bears that were food conditioned and non-food conditioned. And then we used space use patterns and use of developed area. We looked at space use patterns and use of developed areas by these food conditioned and non-food conditioned bears. We also examined the data to see if there's any evidence that these conflict animals were indeed using development outside park boundaries and potentially picking up some bad behaviors there. And we also characterized the movements of these food conditioned and non-food conditioned animals based on different landscape variables. So again, our study took place in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So on the map there, you can see the park boundary is the solid black line, and the dashed gray line or the hatched in box is actually our focal area. And this area we focused on just because that's the part of the park that receives the most conflict reports. You can also see a couple of green lines, and those are backcountry draft lines, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So in the summers of 2015, 2016, and 2017, we specifically targeted trapping conflict bears. So these were animals that the park was receiving some sort of report of conflict behavior. And then during the summer of 2017, we actually received some additional funding. So we trapped bears in backcountry areas of the park. And those bears we were using essentially as a control group. The thought was that those animals were less likely to be food conditioned and to have conflict behavior kind of established already. So for all of our bears, we collected hair samples. We fitted them with GPS radio collars, and then they were released on site. Now for our stable isotope analysis, we looked specifically at carbon and nitrogen isotope ratios for each of the hair samples. We predicted food conditioning status using logistic regression, so food conditioned or not food conditioned. And then we looked at the relationship between that food conditioning status and age class and gender. We also estimated home ranges in core areas in relation to the carbon isotope ratio or delta C13. And then the last thing we really did was we looked at the proportion of development that actually fell in those home ranges and core areas. We also use integrated step selection functions to evaluate how food conditioned and non-food conditioned bears were using landscape, specifically while moving between the national park and the surrounding ex-urban areas. So for this, we actually followed two different pathways for our modeling. We did an exploratory analysis, and that was really geared towards trying to understand whether anthropogenic resource use by bears differed inside versus outside the national park boundaries, and then to see if selection was associated with the level of food conditioning or that delta C13 value. For this, we focused on landscape variables that were associated with anthropogenic features. We also conducted a predictive analysis, and for that, we really wanted to create a model that managers could use to predict how bears may be entering and traversing ex-urban areas. For this, we looked at other variables such as non-anthropogenic landscape variables. So switching gears for our results, in total over those 3 summers, we trapped and collared 53 bears. 43 of them were captured in response to conflict reports specifically, and then the other 10 were the ones that were caught on those backcountry trap lines that were intended to be used as a control group. So we had a total of 31 adult and 21 subadult bears. Now, for our stable isotope analysis, our top logistic regression model included delta C13 as the sole predictor of food conditioning status. So we actually didn't use the nitrogen isotope ratio moving forward. So on that figure there in the left, you can see the delta C13 is on the x-axis, and you can see our discrimination threshold value. That's that dotted line kind of running through the center there. And that was our value that we used to distinguish between bears that are classified as food conditioned versus not. So bears to the right of the line were considered food conditioned, bears to the left were classified as non-food conditioned. And you can see kind of the breakdown. Our final classification there, there's 37 that were considered non-food conditioned and 24 that were food conditioned. Now for our home range and core area relationships, specifically for females, we found that the size of those areas decreased as the mean delta C13 increased. So that level of food conditioning increased. Roughly 56% of our female bears had home ranges that overlapped with private land. And for our males, home ranges and core area sizes did not differ in relation to that delta C13 or food conditioning. In contrast to the female bears, though, 93% of our male bears did have home ranges that encompassed private land. For our female study bears, the mean proportion of development that was within those home ranges and core areas increased with food conditioning, or that, again, that mean delta C13 value. And for our male bears, we did see a similar trend. However, it only approached statistical significance. Now switching gears again, back to our step selection function analysis. For our exploratory analysis, you can see the variables that were included in our top model in that table at the top of the slide. And I really want to just briefly highlight the percent canopy and carbon interaction effect, and then the development level effect. So if you look at the figure on the bottom left, on that, you can see the log relative selection strength on the y-axis per percent canopy of these food conditioned and non-food conditioned bears. And essentially we see that selection is increasing as percent canopy increases for both food conditioned and non-food conditioned animals. But for our food conditioned bears, the increase is less pronounced. So the slope of that line is steep. And selection was higher at lower percentages of canopy cover for our food conditioned bears. And then the figure in the bottom right, you can see that for all the bears, selection strength decreased with the level of development present. Now for our predictive analysis, again, you can see the variables included in our top model. And essentially what we wanted to do was simulate modifying the percent canopy cover and then looking at how bears moved in response to that. So on the top panel, the top row of panels A and B, you can see the percent canopy cover is that dark gray. The city of Gatlinburg is kind of that light gray shaded area. There's not as much canopy cover there. In that dotted box, you can see a forested corridor. And all those red dots are bear movement. So essentially what we did was in panel B, we removed that forested corridor and looked at bear movements. And for our non-food conditioned animals, we saw there's less use of those areas after that forested corridor was removed. We repeated that process, but for our food conditioned animals in panel C and D, you can see that even with the forested corridor removed, you're still seeing quite a bit of movement in that boxed area. So just to wrap up with a few key takeaways, I think it's worth noting that we captured 43 bears in response to reports of conflict, but only 24 of them were classified as food conditioned using our mean delta C13 value as the predictor variable. So behaviorally, what we were seeing was that some conflict bears, while they're displaying conflict behavior, but they weren't necessarily food conditioned, or perhaps they weren't eating enough human foods to fall into that classification. We also saw that the relationship between the home range placement on the landscape and food conditioning may suggest that many of these conflict animals do pick up these behaviors outside park boundaries, or at least those behaviors are reinforced by movement into those areas. We also observed that bears with higher levels of food conditioning were more tolerant of areas with low canopy cover, which is associated with exurban environments. And then lastly, just one more point, there may be some value in expanding that current bear ordinance zone. Again, right now it's only the city of Gatlinburg, but potentially expanding it along the entire northern border of the park, or even surrounding the entire park. So to wrap up, I'd like to thank my major advisor and committee members, the staff in Great Smoky Mountains National Park for all their help getting bears collared. Our funding sources are listed on the slide, and then Terry at the University of Tennessee for all of her assistance with project logistics and budgets. And with that, I guess I'll turn it back over to, thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. It is nice to see that we gained some time for the question. We have so many questions. The last speaker is Tom Smith. Tom is a professor at the Wildlife and Wildlands faculty of Brigham Young University. He worked during his long career in Alaska and Utah, and his research interests include wildlife-human conflicts, particularly involving all three species of North American bears and mountain sheep. More recent works include the Indian slot bear and bobcat. Tom will speak about the environmental influence of the efficacy of bear spray.
Thank you, Mihai. Nice to meet you, and good to be here today. You see in my screen okay on the title screen?
Yes.
Okay, just wanted to check. Yeah, so this title, an investigation of factors influencing bear spray performance, captures the essence of what we did there, and I'd like to recognize my co-authors as well. James Wilder, Jim Wilder, who was at the time Fish and Wildlife Service, he's now Forest Service. Jeff York, who's with Polar Bear International, Marty Obard, lifelong Ministry of Natural Resources Ontario bear biologist, and now retired but very active in polar bear conservation, and Blake Billings, who was an engineering student here at BYU. So those are my co-authors. There, as most of you know, there's been a number of studies that have documented the effectiveness of bear spray and how efficient it can be in protecting users from aggressive bears. But there have been failures that have also been reported, along with speculation regarding the influence that temperature, the wind, repeated use of the cans, and how old the cans are, how those factors influence the efficacy of this product. So that was one thing that's been out there for quite some time, but it's also came to our attention of a number of human bear incidents in northern countries where bear spray is not very commonly used. And when you talk to those people, it's for those reasons. It's too cold, it's too windy, sort of thing. But in those incidents in the last couple of years, it was, pretty obvious that they had nothing. And so just even a can of bear spray may have changed the outcome. So we wanted to take this on and see what we could figure out. Our objective specifically was to document the influence of temperature, wind, repeated discharges, and the age on bear spray performance. So in order to do this, we came up with some methods here, which involved creating this little apparatus that was quite easily done, where we could put a hose. Here you can see this directly into the spray nozzle. It was mounted there, which by depressing the trigger, we could instantly read the pressure in kilopascals. It could have been PSI, but it was kilopascals. And so we knew then we could see what the head pressure was. Then we looked at how those canisters, each one a new canister, was affected by temperature. So we had temperatures, it just turned out it ranged from minus 23 to 25 C. And so that was the setup there. And then also one other thing that we could do with this setup is you could pressurize the system, record the pressure. So that's discharge 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then there's a vent down here. that would allow us to let the gas out and then recharge. And that created extinction curves for the propellant and was able to show us how head pressure changes over time. To determine, as is shown here, that was how we determined pressure in cold, and then also repeated discharges, to see how that cold or different temperatures actually influence spray distance and dispersion, which are shown here with these lines. Cans at varying temperatures were then put onto a standardized height, shot over this white paper, and then we measured distance and dispersion. So that's how that was done. Also, in order to influence the determine the influence of wind. Oops, I'm going to back up. It's a little tricky. This is where Blake Billings came in. He used data that we provided regarding the specific gravity of spray, its nozzle speed and direction, or speed over distance and so forth, fed those into their computer models, created this three-dimensional testing chamber, which is 1 meter square on the end. It's 10 meters long. And then using that, you can see on the left there, there's a small nozzle here. When we load in the file for bear spray, when that's discharged into this three-dimensional space, of course, it's all digital. So we're able to very accurately compare the simulation to the actual product, which we were very pleased with. With that in place, then, we're able to simulate wind at varying speeds from behind, a tailwind, from the side, a crosswind, and from directly in your face, or a headwind. That's really critical. You know, we thought about this. You really can't go out there and do this for a number of reasons, the least of which is a headwind would certainly spray you, and that's unpleasant. Plus, it's very difficult to map a plume. So this was a very good tool that we felt confident about. All right, on continuing on, the U.S. Forest Service, where Jim Wilder now works, the Shoshone National Forest, provided us boxes and boxes and boxes. We had hundreds of cans, which had never been sprayed. You could tell by the nozzle. You can always take a Q-tip and alcohol and swab it out, and if there's any residue at all, it will show. They said they weren't sprayed, and then we tested that. We found a couple that had a little residue, so we discarded those. But then what we did was we simply just weighed them and plotted their weight and their age. So we wanted to look at that. We also looked at the head pressure as a function of age. So, you know, let's take a look at those data now. Not surprisingly, there was a very strong linear relationship between head pressure and canister temperature. And as maybe some of you know, if you leave a canister of that in the windshield of your car, and like here in Utah, it will explode. And I've got pictures of them embedded in the headliners of cars, huge holes punched through the windshield. So as the temperature goes up, the pressure goes up until the can fails. So very linear relationship, which tells you that at minus 20, you've gotten a fairly low pressure. And at plus 20 to 30, it's a fairly high pressure, not surprising there. A distance that the spray went was also obviously, because head pressure is affected, so was the distance. So here we have the temperature on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we have the number of meters from the source that at that temperature, the spray was ejected out. What's interesting, even at the coldest temperature tested, the spray plume still went out as much as 4 meters. Now you can see that here in this drawing. Oh, I'm going to back up, sorry. On the far left, that temperature is 23 below zero. It still went 4 meters. It's not well dispersed. And you can see as it warms, it goes further. It's better dispersion until finally you get kind of the classic shotgun blast on the right, where the stuff's in a big cloud. Okay, so we'll talk about implications. And I think if I remember, I had a messed up slide here, so I'm going to go through it. Sorry. There's my temperatures. Oh, well. Let's take a look now at the wind effects on spray distance. This was the computer simulation of wind. From headwinds from 0 to 10 meters per second, which is about 22 miles an hour in the English system, that reduced, you can see it drops off very fast. In other words, the slightest wind pushes the cloud back and holds its distance down quite a bit. So spray distance dropped dramatically, but then there's enough force, you know, it's coming out of that nozzle at about 60 miles an hour, you know, so there's enough force that it just sits there in all that wind speed and it can't erode it much. So it goes out still 1 to 2 meters, even in a 22-mile-an-hour wind. Tailwinds, of course, blew it off the charts in our 3-dimensional thing. It quickly blew out the end of the 30-meter, you know, with even a 1 mile or 1 meter per second wind, it went out the end. But that's to be expected, obviously, with the tailwind, which would be what I would want if I was facing a bear. You know, it would really go out there. And then with a crosswind, that was quite interesting. It comes out and then it curves left or curves right, but that plume still is going out 3 to 4 meters in up to a pretty strong crosswind. All right, we'll look at this in a minute. Now, this is, we'll talk about it. Right here, repeated short bursts. That's what these dots are. And, you know, I don't know on this one, I don't know where I got that graphic. These are all actual inert can data, but I have a 7th data stream that's also for an actual, you know, can that is full of bear spray, and it's the exact same curve. So what you see here that's relevant is in the first 1 second of a can, this is a 7-second can, which would be a counter assault. In the first 1/7, you lose 50% of the head pressure. So this is not linear. It's certainly not straight across and then drops off like a battery, an alkaline battery, or a lithium ion battery. It drops rapidly and then it levels off until the can is depleted. This is interesting. When we looked at the age, just with one manufacturer counter assault, we looked at the age of cans, and these head pressures here in I'm sorry, got the wrong graph. This is weight. And you can see here, there's a very strong linear relationship between canister age. These would be very new cans over on the right, and very old cans. These are ones that have never been fired. And we found that on average, these across all brands, the loss of weight was 0.65 grams to 1.92 grams per year. And I thought that was very interesting. That's propellant that's coming out, not the bear spray itself. I mean, the oleoresin capsicum, it's the propellant. And when I talked to counter assault, they said, by the way, we did our own tests. It's about 2 grams a year, which was what we found. So sneaky little molecule, it's getting out of there. And these are cans that were never fired. All right, let's take another look here. Well, we're at conclusions already. I didn't want to go over, so I was very disciplined. A couple things you can take from all of this. First of all, when I put in for this paper, it was I don't know, what was it, 2018, 2019. And then, you know, I kept going. So it's been published. At the time, had COVID not stepped in, this would have been, you know, still unpublished data, but I've since published it in the Journal of Wildlife Management. So you can download that if you'd like to read all the details. Here's my conclusions. A couple things. I would not recommend test firing canisters at all. And there's 2 reasons. Number one, if that can weighs, so if I was running, let's say, a conservation organization, I'd weigh all the cans and write the weight on them. There's 230 grams of contents, but the can in total is like 300 or something. Okay, so you're going to see them go down if they're not used. But if you are spraying them like people do, they'll go, well, is this one any good? And they spray it, you know. If it's a heavy can, the weight is largely just propellant. So it's in there. This is a molecule. If you open up a pathway, it's going to fly out of there. So you don't need to test fire to see if it's going to come out. I've talked to all these manufacturers. Failure to fire just doesn't happen, okay? And if it were to, the can would be so light because the propellant would be gone. So don't test fire them. That's for one. And you could also see if you keep test firing, you're losing all of the real push this can has, which you know, 50% in the first second. So if you do 1 second of test firing, you've lost half of the can's propulsion. So not a good idea. The other reason too is I've been out in bear country a lot. Eventually that test firing will drip out of the nozzle. It'll get on your hands. It'll get on your face. It's just nasty stuff. I wouldn't do it. You know, we did show that in even the Arctic, cold can will fire, but that's kind of a dumb thing. Just put it inside your coat, and then it's, you know, your body temperature, and it's going to really blast. Now, if you're camping, what would I do? You know, I don't usually snow camp much, but if it's going to be really cold, I might even have it inside my sleeping bag or under, just to keep it from ambient. But even then, like I said, if I were to fire it, it's going to go at least several meters. That's a lot better than just being nothing coming out. I would discard, you know, their expiration is about 4 years. I would discard after 4 years because about 8% to 10% of the weight is gone and it's propellant. So, you know, that's a pretty good rule of thumb. It does show you, though, cans that were 18 years old were still, you know, had a pretty good push. The contents in terms of oleoresin capsicum, those are stable molecules. They don't break down over time. So in summary, we find no compelling reason not to carry bear spray in all environments where bears occur, whether they're windy or cold. And our goal is to help encourage people in northern countries, particularly where these things are not commonly used. And I go to Churchill every year, and, you know, a lot of locals, I mean, there's polar bears in the town. They still don't carry bear spray because they dismiss it. We have a companion paper here too that's going into review, where we looked at polar bears specifically, and bear spray was 98% effective on polar bears. Okay, thank you very much for your time, and I'll turn it back to Mihai.
Alrighty, thanks, Tom. That was really great. I'm going to help Mihai with the questions. So what we're going to do, if all the speakers could turn their cameras back on. We have a lot, so we're going to try to give everyone a question. We're going to start with the most popular voted one, but we're going to make sure everyone gets a question in this group. So here we go. The first question is for Heather. Are you ready, Heather? Do you have ideas for effective messaging to explain the science to people? When people see big fat bears with several cubs, how do you convey that bears are actually not doing that well overall? And that's from Trishna Dutta.
Well, thanks for the question. I mean, I'm an ecologist, I'm not a social scientist. So in terms of, you know, real recommendations on education pieces, you know, that's my disclaimer there on my answer. But I do think, you know, when I started working for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, most wildlife officers, when they put down a bear, or, you know, had a landowner put down a bear, I mean, they didn't want anyone to know. They didn't want the community to know, because nobody likes when a bear is put down. It's super unpopular. So it was just kind of, you know, that information was not advertised. Now I think that tide is really turning a bit, especially in some areas where they want folks to know, you know, like put it in the paper, you know, a bear gets put down, or, you know, because there's food left out or whatever it is. You know, I don't know necessarily the best education, you know, to get that message across, but I think figuring out how to make the public aware, whether it's in the paper or whatever means, I think is key. I live in Anchorage now, and moose vehicle collisions are a big deal. And so when you come into town, you see this big sign that tells you how many moose have been killed on roads every year, you know, that year, and there's a tally that happens, and it, you know, it really puts it in your head every time you drive by, right, on these road segments. I always wonder if we had a sign on either side of Durango on the highway coming in, how many bears are killed this year, you know, based on human behavior, whatever, conflict activity. And you could see that tally go up, especially in those poor natural food years. You know, how much would that change people's behavior? How much does that kind of emphasize, you know, this kind of piece of human responsibility or the mortality, to really let people know. So I always wanted to do that experiment in Colorado, where we take towns, and some of them we assign and we try to publicize every bear that dies, right? And other ones where you kind of do the status quo, you don't really say when that happens, and, you know, what would the response be? Would people change their behavior? I don't know. I'd love to see someone do that experiment.
Thank you.
Next question. is for Cody from David Telesco. You indicated Tom Smith provided your data for the US. Where did Tom get the data? And did you or Tom contact the state wildlife agencies directly?
Right, good question. So in the case of both Dr. Smith and Dr. Herrero, most of the data was compiled by them and their colleagues over the course of their careers. So over 30, in the case of Dr. Smith, about 30 years. You can correct me if that's wrong, Dr. Smith, and in the case of Dr. Herrero, even longer. So they both have been compiling kind of databases of their own. And in the case of Dr. Smith, he's been focusing on the United States, and Dr. Herrero has been focusing on Canada. And so what we're doing is we're merging the two resources and then supplementing them from other sources that we found. And from what I understand, the majority of the incident data that they've gotten from various different sources, newspapers, many of which were accessed online, personal accounts, things like that. I hope that is a good answer.
Awesome. All righty, Andrea, you're up. It says, this is from Tabitha Graves. It says, I love the idea of using the night light / Strava to show activity. Is there any research on whether there is an, oh, this is for not Andrea Morehouse, the other, forget we have two. Is there any research on whether there is any spatial bias to people using Strava? Thinking about, for sample or examples, fewer users in small villages, maybe small issue.
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's one of the reasons why we decided to validate in the first place. So, so first of all, there is a little bit of geographic bias. It's user changes across areas for sure. It's not, the app is not used everywhere the same way. So validation, like local validation with other kind of data, camera trapping, for instance, or GPS data for like smaller studies from humans, of course, could help validate and understand it, which is the representation in the area. In our area, it seemed like it was very representative, which the external dataset we used. It definitely has a greater power over smaller areas rather than larger areas, because over larger areas you might have the heat map might count those like areas where there is a high use, like larger villages or larger cities or larger areas with higher tourism. But overall, it still provides a pretty powerful relative presence of humans. And just on top of that, there's other few studies that shows that Strava, for instance, there's other apps. Strava just provides the heat map online. There's other studies that show that Strava is one of the most representative among the apps. They've done that on bicycle, they've done that on tourism in the US, in Europe. For sure, there are areas where it won't work, someplace in Asia maybe, or some remote island. For sure doesn't work in North Korea. If someone has the possibility to validate the sample, I think that would be a good way to go to be sure it's representative of the study area. I hope that answered the question.
Question is for Laura from Brian Schick. Ideas for how we increase public acceptance of bears where they are recolonizing. People seem to comment often that they don't live in bear area, trying to reduce the responsibility to be bear wise. Maybe time will help.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. That's something that we're certainly dealing with in Missouri quite a bit because we have this growing, expanding bear population, and we get a lot of dispersing bears showing up in the greater St. Louis area. So one of the more populated parts of the state. So we've been kind of working to do a lot of outreach in those areas in response to the handful of dispersing bears that show up. And lucky for us at this point, there's a lot of interest in bears in the state. So there's a lot of media coverage of those events, and that media coverage has been very positive. But whether or not that dictates people changing their behavior, I think is a completely different story. So there's step one of just making people realize that we even have bears in Missouri, and one could show up in St. Louis is kind of the first step for us. We've looked at doing some analyses of our human bear conflict reports relative to bear habitat and using that to help predict spatially where we might see bears showing up in the future. So we're going to be using that to kind of inform some targeted outreach there. But I think we maybe need to get away from this area of the state is bear country, and we've been trying to just say the state's bear country. I don't know. I don't have a great answer to that. I'm totally open to suggestions, and I think there might be some other folks on here on this call that might have other ideas with that as well. But I think that is definitely one of the challenges that we face. And in looking back at a lot of the proceedings from some of the other places and stuff like that, I think that's been the challenge that we've been facing for the last several decades as bear numbers have continued to increase.
Alrighty. If anyone does want to elaborate on any answer, go ahead. This next one is for Andrea Morehouse. It's from Gordon Stenhouse. He says, great talk and good project. The amount of work involved by everyone is impressive. Have you looked at data in context of the stop of the spring bear hunt in 2006 and in relationship to translocation numbers for your study area?
Thanks, Gord. Short answer, no. The 2006 data, or the stopping of the hunt, I haven't done an analysis on that. What I can tell you is from looking at sort of the whole picture of all of the occurrence records, it does seem like they kind of start to increase a bit after 2006, but I don't have a statistic to back that up. I can just tell you that visually looking at the graphs. The translocation data, that is on my list. That would be a great piece to add to this piece, is to pull that stuff specifically for Southwestern Alberta. I know across the province that translocations have not decreased, but I haven't pulled that, and that is, like I say, it's on my list of things to do because I think it would help add to that story. Most bears are being translocated because of livestock depredation, and livestock depredation in the area hasn't decreased. So I don't know. The ideal picture would be that I could also say that we've seen a decrease in the translocation of bears from Southwestern Alberta, but I know that livestock depredation in Southwestern Alberta has continued to go up. So I don't know if we're going to see that, but yes, good reminder, a good question, and I will try and get that done, because I agree it would be a good piece of information to have. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Andrea. Next question is for Julia. You mentioned that honey production is a benefit to ranchers, and I think you said it was because of the bears. What is the association between bears and honey production? The question is from David Telesco.
Well, Varys, thanks for the question. And yeah, I didn't explain that much, but the project has like a social aspect and the ecological aspect. The ecological aspect is all the camera trapping work, but on the social part was to identify possible economic alternatives to cattle ranching in general. And so they started a honey production project within the framework of the Andean Bear Project. So obviously, like, they related directly. They know that, okay, since the Bear Project came, now we have honey production because it's part of the project and we can sell the honey. So that shifted a little bit the like how people is seeing the bears and how they're seeing conservation in general, because they're seeing an economic benefit to it.
Sorry, I lost my mouse for a second. Alrighty, this next one's for Denisse. Do Andean bears raid crops at night? Couldn't help but think of the recent paper, The Ecology of Human Carnivore Coexistence, Lamb et al. 2020, where bears adapted to human presence through more nocturnal activity. So the main question was, do Andean bears raid crops at night?
Well, actually, we don't know. We don't have this information because we work inside a protected natural area. So we, at the moment, we don't have any data from camera trapping in these areas where there is a human activity. But it will be very interesting to complement the information we already have. Thank you.
Yeah, that was from Sabrina Bradford, by the way. I didn't.
Next question is for Jessica from Kerry Nicholson. Great talk. Using hair and SIA means a time lag. Bears that are currently causing problems may not have eaten human food when they grew hair. Did you resample these problem bears later to see if they continue to eat to show in hair?
Yeah, good question. We actually did not intentionally go out and try to recapture bears and resample them. If you notice in the slides, I did mention that, you know, we collared 53 bears for the study. And in our hair data, there was over 60 sampled. And some of the bears, just because of conflict reports, we did handle them a second or third time. And so we were able to look at a few of them over the course of multiple years, how their like level of food conditioning changed. I will say there's only one that their status actually changed, and that was, I believe it was a female, went from non-food condition the first year we caught her, and then the next time we sampled her, her status changed to food condition. But no, we didn't intentionally go out and do that. I think it'd be really neat to follow some of these bears over multiple years and do that, but maybe another grad student will want to tackle that.
Okay, thank you. This one's for Robert. How did you determine the study and survey sites? How did you select the people to interview or questionnaires? Thanks.
First of all, thanks for the question. We select the areas based on opportunity. The big landscape were selected based on opportunity because in most of these places, we were developing together governmental organization, the data collection in order to increase the habitat of the Andean bear, but also reduce the human Andean bear interaction. So we have, based on the, let me remember the name, the strategy of conservation of the Andean bear in the National Park of Colombia, we have 5 core conservation units. We work in 4 of those core conservation units. But inside is different. We work in those big landscape, but for the selection of the area fit at all, we overlap the distribution of the Andean bear with the distribution of people, and we survey most of the village that were inside these threat areas that we call. And in those areas, something special happened because in part of the farm, the people live there, but part of the farm, the people don't inhabit that farm. So we needed or we survey all the people that we can find in the area. And it was one person per farm, most of all the responsible for the farm.
Is it my turn again? I'm supposed to go again. Okay, I think everyone's got a question. We're gonna
Sorry,
just go back.
I just exit from the web page. I need to log
Oh, it's
in.
okay. That's okay. Okay, Heather, this is from Michael Proctor. Oh, it might be a doozy. No, just kidding. Heather, cool project. Did you have plans to explore if this system is part of a large source sink dynamic with adjacent wilder areas? For instance, what size of wilder area is needed to compensate for the reported decline?
Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we have some kind of continuing work being led by Stuart Bragg on where we're looking at population trends over a broader area of not just Durango, but a little bit further than that. So we should hopefully get a bit of a sense of that. But what I will say is, you know, this kind of like, you know, bears, urban bears versus town bears, and that you kind of have this Durango population and this wildland population. Across our studies from the system, I mean, we found that that is just really not the case. We had bears collared in the wildest parts of the state, you know, in the southwest corner of the state, that during those hard natural, like really poor natural food years, I mean, they beelined into areas of human development to use human foods as a source of subsidy. So I think what was like really striking about our study is that there weren't many really wild bears. I mean, bears in the study, it's really clear they all knew about development. They knew where to go for subsidy. They tended to not use it if they didn't need it, but man, when they needed it, they would come. And you could have bears, you know, in the 11, 12,000 feet, you know, 20 miles of the crow flies from the nearest road, paved road. And in those hard times, my cat wants to answer too with me, but in those hard times, like the bears would just come in. So, you know, it's not just what happens with bears around town in those poor food years. It's like bears getting drawn in from, you know, a lot of areas. Yeah. So hopefully that answered the question a bit.
So the next question goes to Andrea Corradini from Trishna Dutta. Very cool concept. Wouldn't be the COI be based on Strava users, of number of Strava users? How did you decide on this particular app? How about pulling in other apps, Google, Map, Myron, others?
Thanks, Trishan, for the question. So the most obvious one was that you can access those data relatively easily. You can access the heat map through the web, and of course you can also there's different ways you can purchase the data through an interface they have, or locally in some cities you can actually retrieve some of the data for free. That was a policy they did during the COVID. We tried to see for other apps, but that's turned out with some of the publication we see this Strava is one of the most widespread and used. We think that there is a very big potential with Google data, for instance, but currently we don't have a way to access those ones. But we think that the time we could use the Google data for any studies, for any species, that might be really a game changer, because you could really like understand like a human mobility and a completely different level and a completely different scale. And but we don't have access to those data, and to our knowledge, we couldn't find like a reasonable a sample size for other apps in, at least in our study area. It might be different in other study areas. They're mostly in Western countries. I'm not aware how's the app usage in other countries, more in Eurasia, more in the Asian part, but that one that fits the best for our contest and study area.
Cool. Okay, Cody, this one is for you, which we are combining we have two questions that are similar. So they ask about fact checking your information. So the first one says, how will you fact check the information from media? Often media articles have misinformation or are using or missing information. And then the other one says, how are you weighting the sources of information? For example, reports on newspaper and magazines are very often incorrect or incomplete. However, agents' reports, especially post-incident analysis, are more accurate. So we if you can combine those two.
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. So a lot of if we had any incidents in the prior databases that were, we had to use some personal judgment in the matter, but if we had any that we thought were particularly questionable, we just axed them, so they're not in our database, or they won't be in the final database. And then it's definitely very true that for a lot of the newspaper stories and things like that, they're very incomplete. So for most of the incidents, we don't have, we will not have data for a lot of the variables that we're hoping to get. We're just getting all the information that we can. So for instance, we have 200 different possible variables, each of which makes up its own column. And in an ideal world, we would have information on every single one of those variables, and we would fill each of them in. But obviously, that doesn't happen pretty much ever. So if the account doesn't have information on a particular variable that we're interested in, then we make note that there's no information, and we'll take that into account in our data analysis. And then we are, like I said, we're kind of still in the data accumulation and organization phase, so we haven't finalized everything, but we're definitely considering weighting, like was mentioned, weighting the sources, because it is definitely true that there are better sources than others. We have primary accounts and reports from government management agencies, and then we have, anecdotal accounts. So we're definitely thinking about ways to take that into account and weight them accordingly.
Next question. I think I will cheat a little bit. It's a question for Laura from Tabitha Graves. I enjoyed your history lesson. Fascinating to see how far bear management has come. Curious to hear whether there were any good ideas that you found in your research that managers had early on that were never pursued, tested.
You know, oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I just wanted to add also a question from my side. There was a difference in use of bears by Native Americans and European colonists. Do you have any ideas of it? This is my question. So sorry, Lori, for tricking you with.
So the first part of it, I I can't say that I combed through each of those proceedings with enough detail to get if there was anything in there. The one thing that was most noticeable to me was that the earlier meetings for a long time were recorded. So the proceedings are actual transcriptions of the conversations that occurred at those meetings. And so you have the who said it, the question, the answer, the discussion, and everything, which is not something that we currently do for those meetings. So that was really fascinating, actually being able to see what the conversation looked like and who was responding and everything. There were a lot of concepts and a lot of different things that we still talk about today. So I can't say that there was anything that I noticed that was talked about but wasn't done. But I think the level of detail of some of the conversations is definitely less than the way we talk about it today, or how we historically have done it, at the last several, in my time as a bear biologist, 10 years at these meetings. One of the conversations related to telemetry equipment was literally about the different types of batteries and the circuitry, and the most technical explanation of telemetry that I was completely a foreign concept to me. So some of that was really, really interesting. In terms of the different use by settlers and indigenous peoples, I didn't get into any detail, but there definitely is a difference there. So the level of use in many areas and how the animals were revered, there's definitely a difference there from colonial users and indigenous peoples. And I would find it super interesting, but it was one of those, it was every different rabbit hole that you could go down with some of this stuff. So Mihai, no, I don't have any great insights into that, but other than, I think there's noticeable differences, and it was discussed a little bit, but not anything that I came across in great detail without going into some of those really old historical accounts, which there certainly are. There's a lot of information there. I just didn't delve into it.
All right, Julia, nice idea to shift from human concern, cattle, to bear concern, competition. Are your results of decreasing bear presence as cattle presence increases shared in other areas? Another talk in a park suggests bears shifted time of activity.
Well, yeah, like I look into the activity. The thing is that bears are very active only during the day, like between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. I think that 6 p.m. is the latest that we spotted a bear on this area. But cows are active all day long, like even during the night, 2 a.m. we still get a lot of cow and cattle pictures. So like I think that it's a more aggressive species, I would say, with the environment, with the area. They are like roaming and eating around all the time. I think this is a result of extensive unattended cattle ranching in a mountain area where there were not supposed to be cows around. Yeah, it's more like that. Like I seen Denisse talk, it was very interesting. We also kind of like took into account this idea. We also like counted people activity, and like as people just leave their cattle alone, we have very, very few pictures of non-researchers. So it's just like cows all day long, and bears just keeping the way they do it all the time, like between 8 a.m., 5 p.m. And when cattle are, because this is the practice, like when rainy season starts, the people start to use more land for crops. So they remove the cattle from there and they move them to other areas. That's the moment that we see more bear pictures.
Thank you, Julia. A question for Robert from Jennifer 14 Morehouse. As an alternative for increasing trust in government agency, would it be feasible for non-profits to come in and conduct the work instead, similarly to how Defenders of Wildlife works in the United States?
Thanks for the question. we have been working in several ways through the time. This is a possibility, you know, a non-governmental organization that take the action and works, but it have a problem. The problem is the period of time that the organization can be working in those areas. Our problem is that sometimes we are successful reducing human Andean bear conflict and improving the positive interaction between the species. But if we do not have this normal, the social norm, and someone that is permanently in the place in who we have trust, the local people change the behavior. We have experience in Ecuador where we were very successful decreasing the human Andean bear negative interaction by reducing the damage in livestock. But sadly, before we leave the place, people in 2 years return the normal way they developed before the activities, and the conflict increase again. So it must be done through governmental organizations that work on the areas in order to be present through the time. But we believe that the partnership between governmental organization, non-governmental organization, and local people is the best to work.
Alrighty. Sorry, there was someone else on my window. I lost track. Heather, were you able to record the cause of death in the urban areas? If so, how does it differ from natural habitat? Was there an increase of stress, take, car strikes, nutrition, etc. in the urban areas?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yep, big difference. In that paper, we have a map actually showing where bears died and then by cause. And so you can see right around development, there's, I mean, you see all the mortalities that happen along the roads, you know, lots of roadkill, accidents, you know, cubs climbing up power poles, getting executed, bears eating rat poison stored in sheds, you know, all kinds of things. But yeah, really dominated in town by landowner removals and vehicle kills. And then, you know, outside of town on yeah, mostly for us, what's national forest and BLM land is it's harvest, you know, that's the main source of mortality. So, yep, big spatial differences.
And the winner is Andrea Morehouse. And I think Trishna for putting the more question than anybody. Andrea, do you have any idea how the carcass removal program impacts other scavengers such as bird of prey, mesocarnivores, etc. in the system?
That's a good question. I don't have those data. I know in other areas of the world that they've looked at that, and carcass, the disposal of carcasses certainly has a variety of impacts on. There's been other research where it's shown that it's, you know, been a really big food source for avian scavengers, and removing that has hurt their populations. And there's been some other research in other areas where they've also looked at foxes. I believe it was from Israel, where they saw a similar sort of decline once those carcasses are removed. So it's the carcass removal is sort of an interesting one, because there's a number of different components to that, both from an ecological standpoint, but also the social and political aspects of it. Because it has to do with, you know, there's a number of regulations around the disposal of carcasses, and a lot of it is influenced by, at least in Canada and elsewhere in the world, you know, it has to do with the detection of mad cow disease, or BSE, in cattle, and those prions have to be destroyed. And so there's only certain ways in which you can dispose of those carcasses, and each of those different disposal options have a number of different implications. And so you're right that there could be other implications to other carnivores in the ecological community, but I don't have data on those for this area here. It would certainly be an interesting question to look into there, because there are a number of species that do use those carcass piles.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. Jessica, we have a couple of isotope questions, so I was going to try to combine two. So this one is from Trishna. It says, is there a way to decide a threshold for the delta C and carbon and nitrogen ratio used to distinguish food condition individuals from the others? And then Dick Scheidler asked, do these bears graze significantly on crops outside the park? If so, how does that affect the carbon isotope portion in describing food condition versus non-food condition? So I don't know if you can put those together.
Yeah, so for the first question, I think he said it was from Trishna. Trying to distinguish between the two. So we essentially did that. That was our, we had that discrimination threshold value. So basically what we had to do was, we had all of our bears, and some of them we went ahead and pre-classified as like, we're pretty certain that they are food conditioned. And then we had ones that we were very certain they were non-food conditioned. So you have to go ahead and kind of pre-classify some of those, build that model, the logistic regression model, and then we could use an ROC curve to actually determine our threshold value. So in our top model, carbon was really the only important predictor. Nitrogen wasn't super important, which that wasn't surprising. I think there are some studies that have been done out west where those black bears are consuming meat a little bit more than our bears, and nitrogen isotopes are really an indicator of meat in the diet. And black bears, at least in the Smokies, don't use a whole lot of that. So it wasn't totally surprising that we were only relying on that carbon isotope, but for us, again, that discrimination threshold value, I believe, was like negative 23.3. And so then from there, we could use that value to classify all of those individuals that were unknown to us, which were a majority of those bears. And then I think the second question was about crop use outside the park. So at least in our study area, most of the communities immediately adjacent to the park, it's not really heavy agriculture like you find in some other areas where a lot of cornfields and things like that. We have more like little mountain tourist towns. So a lot of, nightly rentals, a lot of dumpsters. We have a ton of tourists coming in that maybe aren't familiar with staying in bear country. And so what we saw primarily, and then even by just visiting some of the GPS data we found that most of those points are actually at unsecured trash containers. I would suspect because carbon's an indicator, or the heavy carbon isotope that we're looking at specifically is an indicator of things like corn and sugarcane in the diet, which if you think about the human diet, it's pretty corn and sugarcane heavy. We would see, again, that heavier isotope. But it was mostly from, I would say, human food products found in things like dumpsters rather than a cornfield.
Okay, next question, it's from Karen Noyce to Laura. Changes in public attitude towards bears has been key in recovering population. But as the recover conflicts increases, how do we keep attitudes from reverting? How much conflict is acceptable to you and to different public factions? Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's one that I struggle with, because I think when we look at, in particular, I'll speak to black bears. That's where my experience lies. The public is generally pretty positive towards black bears, at least in a lot of the areas that I've worked with. And I don't know that we've, in Missouri, we certainly have not reached any kind of social carrying capacity But yeah, I mean, that is a challenge. I think consistent messaging is one aspect that's really important. So I think the Bearwise program can do a lot towards that, being able to provide just a consistent message to everybody, regardless of where you're at. There's not, you know, it doesn't change based on jurisdiction and things like that. I think that is important. And I think being proactive in that education, so that there's this expectation that, yeah, bears are here, and there's that knowledge base, kind of what Brian's question was earlier. How do you get ahead of that? So for those folks that aren't currently living in bear country, how do you teach them? I think that is important to kind of keeping those positive attitudes, talking about the ecological benefits of bears and things like that, making sure that that's part of the conversation. But I think as managers, that's one of those things that we need to weigh, right? Managing those bear populations within levels before we're reaching kind of that critical mass in social tolerance. So keeping bears within those levels while those populations while we're able to do that. And I think that's something that's challenging. We're working in Missouri to look at establishing some population benchmarks. So, you know, we suspect our habitat can sustain a lot more bears than our public will tolerate. So how do we outline that, and how do we manage within that proactively before we get to a point where we're dealing with overabundant bears and we're starting to see that reversion in those social tolerance levels. But if anybody else has any information, Heather, you know, with stuff you've dealt with, by all means, anybody else jump in. I think that's a question that can go to the whole group here.
Alrighty, well, I think we have time for one more question, especially because this kind of brings it back home to Montana, where the conference is supposed to be. And it's for Andrea Morehouse. Are grizzlies moving out onto the Alberta prairies as they are in Montana, as seen in Frank Van Man's presentation? What similarities or differences are there between prairie use and conflict response in Canada and the US?
Yes, very, very similar. So Southwestern Alberta is the bear population here is a small part of a much larger international population that includes the Northern Continental Divide population in Montana, which you heard about yesterday or on Tuesday during the plenary, as well as southeastern British Columbia. So it's all one big population, and Southwestern Alberta is just a small part of that. And we're seeing the very same patterns that they're seeing on that eastern front of the Rockies in Montana. Bears are expanding eastward. We're seeing conflicts move eastward as that population starts to reappear in areas they haven't been in quite some time. So yeah, same population spread that we're seeing down there. And as far as conflict response, you know, I think it's very similar. Like there's a lot of similar efforts in Montana. Somebody was mentioning the other day in one of the talks, I forget who, but the Blackfoot Challenge is a group that's done a lot of similar work. In fact, there's a number of ranchers from Southwestern Alberta that went down to meet with other ranchers in that Blackfoot area, and that's has been really great, that sort of information exchange across the border. And I know that, you know, I'm in touch with folks in Montana and you know, other bear managers. People talk, you know, I'm not a bear manager, but I know that the bear managers do talk to one another, and the conflict response is quite similar. And yeah, it's the same population of bears. So, you know, I think the more that we can start to think about it as one larger population of bears, I think that's really ultimately where, you know, my personal opinion, where I'd like to see it go, managed on more of an ecosystem basis rather than these state and jurisdictional boundaries. But, you know, that's what we do right now, because that's what we have to do. But yeah, so I think hopefully that answers your question.
I also hope that it answered. So it was a marathon. I counted more than 36 questions for this session, and we succeeded with actually no, the speaker succeeded to answer to 20 questions.